All right. Welcome, everyone, to the Illusion of Consensus podcast. I'm here with Dave Smith, comic Dave Smith, I should say, as that comic is burned into his name permanently. And I did not know that was part of his legal name, but apparently we refer to Dave Smith from now on as comic Dave Smith. So welcome. Thanks for coming on.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm glad we can make this happen.
Yeah. Yeah. I was telling you just before we started, I started watching you probably senior year of high school, if not right after, and been watching you over the years on Rogan and other podcasts, and greatly appreciate your insights and the way you think. I've always had a very open mind and try to listen to all sides. I'm not a foreign policy guy. I've never opined about foreign policy really at all publicly. I've talked a lot about identity politics, culture war issues over the past couple of years, big pharma, COVID mandates, civil liberties, free speech, things like that. But when it comes to foreign policy, I try to listen to all sides. So I listen to the Barry Weiss's, Ben Shapiro's, Daily Wire folks, and I listen to people like you, Glenn Greenwald, Tucker Carlson, things like that. But I've greatly learned a lot over the past few years watching you on a number of podcasts, and it's really helped shape my thinking on a lot of issues. So really appreciate what you've had to say over the years, and it's been very educational.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And like I said to you before we started recording, I've appreciated a lot of your work too, particularly the podcast with Jay Bhattacharya. And I appreciate that attitude when it comes to the foreign policy debate. I wish more people had that attitude. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. So we have a lot to talk about today. We have a bit of an outline that I created for this discussion. The format of this podcast is mostly going to be us responding to the Sam Harris Douglas Murray podcast. So you did. 99% of people will know you debated Douglas Murray on Joe Rogan's podcast, which is very explosive, and a lot of people watched it. And you guys both did a lot of podcasts talking about it afterwards. And then the one podcast that I closely watched was Douglas on Sam's podcast. And they did a very kind of proper, comprehensive postmortem of your discussion with Douglas on Joe's podcast. And I thought we'd go over it and talk about it because there are some really interesting things to talk about here when it comes to the new information landscape, the decline of mainstream media, independent media, trust in experts, the expert class, who to trust, how to understand the world, what information sources to use, what's kind of the heuristic to understand complex issues like history, geopolitics, global affairs, health, big pharma, nutrition, like all these things that are popping up in a lot of discussions recently. And so I thought we'll talk about specific claims in that podcast, but I thought that Douglas and Sam podcast was probably the best articulation I've seen from the kind of more pro-establishment side that's concerned about misinformation and the rise of independent media. So for whatever that's worth, they pretty systematically went through a lot of things, and I think Sam is a fairly consistent and fairly systematic thinker on some of these things. So I think it'll be good for us to respond to a lot of the claims in that podcast. So we'll do that in a sec here. But first of all, there's been a few things happening in the last couple days. Your spat with Gad Saad, he seems to be attacking you and sort of sarcastically. He does this humorous thing on Twitter a lot where he's kind of jokingly throwing jabs at people he disagrees with. I'll just quickly say that I've watched Gad, similar to you, on Rogan over the last few years. And when it comes to evolutionary psychology, I think he's absolutely brilliant in talking about, a lot of people know about evolutionary biology, stuff that Brett Weinstein and others talk about. But his stuff on certain evolutionary principles as it applies to dating, relationships, mating, and he has a great book on consumer instincts and marketing and things like that. I think are incredibly fascinating. And he's also been a strong opponent of identity politics. That's been a big part of his brand over the past few years, is opposing identity politics and far left cancel culture. And so I found it a little strange when he was attacking you, and I'll get your response to that in a sec. And then Tom Woods, who I've talked to before, is a libertarian podcaster. He was defending you, and then Gad responded to him and said, "Oh, does Tom have a Jew problem?" And I found that really strange because that just reminds me of all the far left tactics where you oppose someone or disagree with their ideas and like, "Oh, it's because he hates black people. Oh, he hates gay people. Oh, he hates trans people." And that was really strange to see someone who's one of the most powerful opponents of identity politics and cancel culture to just insinuate that this is because Tom Woods has an anti-Semitic problem of some kind.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, I don't know what more I can even say about it than what you just said. That there, I would just probably use stronger language. Like it's pathetic, and it's such like the level of hypocrisy. And look, I mean, I think that's kind of like one of the broader themes. That's a through line through a lot of these things. You know, one of the big reactions to the me and Douglas Murray episode on Rogan was people just playing old tapes of Douglas Murray and how he's completely contradicting everything he supposedly stood for. And this is, you know, this happens a lot in life in general. It happens a lot where people will be very consistent until there's something that they particularly care about that comes up. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, the rules don't apply anymore. And Israel happens to be that example for a lot of people for whatever reason, and there's deep reasons involved in that, but there's many. Like I don't really care about like any of the kind of stupid insults or jokes that Gad was making on Twitter. Like that's fine, I'll go back and forth with those. I have very thick skin. I come from a background in stand-up comedy. And I don't, by the way, Douglas Murray could keep calling me comic, Dave, so I don't take that as an insult. That's okay. That's what I am. I'm a traveling stand-up comedian. But it's like, to me, by the way, I find like journalist or expert to be a much more of a pejorative than comedian. So I'm fine with that label. But I don't, it's like, he could say that, the insults, all that stuff's kind of dumb. It's dumb Twitter stuff. It's like, what about my argument can you attack? And that's what I think, like what's been revealing, and in a way, the reason why I think that a lot of these guys have really hurt their reputation, and I've kind of come out winning on that ground, is because it just becomes glaringly obvious that none of them are willing or able to offer one counter to any of the arguments that I'm putting forward. It's always like an attempt to kind of character smear or to divert or to discuss something else entirely. For Gad to say about guys like me and Tom Woods that we have like Jew problems. I mean, look, dude, you got your finger on the pulse there. If you want to find people who have issues with the Jews, they're not that hard to find. Yep. They're out there and talking about it. Yeah. But like to say guys like me and Tom Woods, it's ridiculous. It's on the level of like, with the black face of white supremacy or the dumbest shit you would see out of these woke dummies. And it's kind of, I will say, if I'm being completely honest, it's a bit sad for me to see some of these guys fall to that level. It's like you slowly see, this is why I always thought it was so ridiculous when they started using that woke right term as they're going around calling everyone who disagrees with them a bigot and championing speech laws. They're calling other people woke. It's like you just literally see, like, it's Ben Shapiro, as soon as the topic is Israel, he just starts morphing into the blue-haired 20-year-old he was debating 10 years ago or whatever. So I think it's too obvious for most people to not see through it.
And we'll get into this because I think Douglas was probably the first person, at least after the debate, to make this claim, or at least this like caricatured idea of you, which Gad repeated, which is that you basically source all your opinions from Wikipedia. You're just some Wikipedia masturbating guy who's just, you don't read original text, you don't read the authors, you don't read the history books. You're this illiterate high school, college bro who's just on Wikipedia, just getting all his sources and not fact checking. Do you want to fact check that for us? Is that true?
Well, I got if you want, I'm in a hotel room right now. I'm not even home. And I got a Benny Morris book about the history of the Palestinian refugee problem over here. I'll get it.
I hope Gad is watching.
Here you go. This is my latest journey into Wikipedia. This is what I've been spending my weekend doing. I don't know. Wow. I mean, like, what do you say? I don't know. Maybe that was unnecessary for me to show it. It's just, you asked it. It's right here. So, but, what can you say to this stuff? I mean, it's an absurd. It's naked. It's like all they can do. It's again. It's the same. It's identical to the woke argumentation. All they can do is go after your character, right? So they can't ever take on your argument. So everything has to be about you. If you notice, which by the way, I could do this too. Like when I was with on Rogan's podcast, I could go over all the shit Douglas Murray's gotten wrong over the years, which would be every single war plus COVID. He got all the major issues of our time wrong. But I'm sitting there, if you notice the whole time, I'm arguing the issues. I'm arguing what actually led up to the war in Ukraine, what actually created this problem in Gaza, what this general said, what this CIA director said, I'm talking about the history, the argument. All they can talk about is me, because they can't take on any of the arguments. So it becomes, oh, you just get your information from Wikipedia. Like, okay, all right, dude. Like, what do you, and anybody, again, this would be like, I don't know what to say. It's pretty damn obvious from anybody. I've done about, at this point, like 10 debates on Israel, Palestine, something like that. Including winning an Oxford style debate at Princeton University against Josh Hammer, who's a senior editor at Newsweek.
Oh yeah, I saw that.
If
Yeah.
if anybody's going to listen to me talk about any of the issues that I really talk about and say he hasn't read books about this, like, what is that? It's not even like beginning to approach an argument. It's so silly. And so I just, to me, I'm kind of like, all right, keep going with that. I think you just lose credibility with the people that you're trying to persuade. I assume the goal here is to try to persuade people, right? That's why we're doing this publicly, and not me and you aren't just meeting over coffee. We're doing a show about this. We want to put our ideas forward. So, okay, if that's what you got.
Yeah. I want to play one clip from from Douglas Murray on Michael Moynihan's podcast before we get into the Sam podcast. And I do have to do a bit of throat clearing on my end, which is that, by the way, so for people who don't know, this is the first time I'm talking to Dave outside of DMs and text. But I've actually met Douglas a couple of times in person, and we've had very nice interactions. I've also had him on the podcast before. We've never podcasted before. We had a great discussion a couple years ago. I think it was his War on the West book. And also, credit where credit is due. And I know you agree with this. His some of his work is absolutely brilliant when it comes to calling out and ringing the alarms on the dangers of mass migration to Europe and other Western societies, and the very obvious clashes between Western values and more extreme Islamic values, attitudes towards free speech and homosexuality and just women's freedom and things like that. Douglas and Sam, actually, for that matter too, both have been very articulate and eloquent in expressing some of those concerns, which the far left is very unhappy about, and have called both of them out. And so I respect that. And in Douglas's book, Madness of Crowds, is also excellent on identity politics. And I share a lot of his concerns about the far left. And this sort of ties into one claim, and I don't think it's going to be in the clip that we're going to play, but Michael Moynihan said he's associated with the Free Press, Barry Weiss's outlet. He's a journalist. I don't know too much more about him, but I've seen him in a number of podcasts. Seems like a smart guy. But he said in the podcast that Joe had you with Dave Smith on it, Dave, who opposes everything about your politics. And I was like, everything? I don't think Dave opposes everything about Douglas's politics.
Well, no, I'm actually much better on the issues that Douglas is good on. I mean, not only do I agree with Douglas's position on immigration, but I wouldn't have supported destabilizing the entire region and creating the migrant crisis to begin with. I mean, overthrowing Muammar Gaddafi in Libya was a huge component of the mass migration into Europe. And Douglas, although he lied through his teeth and said, I was very iffy on that, go read his columns about it. He certainly didn't claim to be iffy at the time. But the truth is that overthrowing Saddam Hussein, overthrowing Muammar Gaddafi, destabilizing Syria, ultimately getting a regime change there too, this had a huge impact in destabilizing the region and driving refugees by the millions into Europe. So, yeah, no, I don't know if I disagree with him about everything, but I tend to agree. I think he's good on some of those issues, but I think he's also, his advocacy is somewhat responsible for them.
Okay, that makes sense. And lastly, I'll just say I have nothing against Douglas. Again, personally, I've had great interactions with him, and he actually, just on a one-on-one level, was very nice and generous a couple years back when I couldn't find any places to publish my work on vaccine side effects and other reporting on COVID when I was having a hard time trying to publish my work. And he and I had some exchange over DMs where he, I guess without getting into the specifics because it was private, but he was very generous and kind in helping facilitate a connection with someone that turned out to be quite fruitful and helpful in just figuring out how to move forward as a journalist in a time of great censorship and suppression of ideas during COVID. So I've only
Stop humanizing my enemy.
Yeah, so I've only ever had nice interactions with Douglas, and secondly with Sam. I also like him personally. I interviewed him about meditation, mindfulness. He and I both share a lot of interest in Buddhism and Eastern spirituality, and so there's an interview on my original Substack, the Meta Mystic, where I interview him about meditation and the nature of psychological suffering and attachment and self-transcendence and things like that. And then we later on had a private exchange over COVID where I thought he was being fairly irresponsible in his coverage and promoting the COVID shots. And so we had a long exchange there. And I appreciate that he engaged with me and took my concerns seriously. He didn't really change his tone on any of the things that I pointed out to him. But he did show, to his credit, a willingness and an openness to consider that the mRNA vaccines were potentially more dangerous than what was originally thought when he was promoting it on his podcast in 2021. But yeah, so I don't like engaging in character assassination. I don't want to call them stupid or idiotic. Like I like them personally, but I do disagree with them on a few core things, and we'll methodically talk about some of the things in their podcast together. And it's worth highlighting the disparity here. Like, at least when it comes to Douglas, like when Douglas talks about you, as we'll get into in some of the clips, like he really is not a respectful, civil tone at all. Well, like I think you've been far more respectful to him. I think you've, in response to him treating you like a high school bro who doesn't really know what he's talking about, have also exchanged the fire, and you guys both have some fiery exchanges on Twitter and different podcasts talking about each other. But it's really unfortunate to see him and others talk to you in this really condescending way. It's really not indicative of like a healthy, free speech promoting civil discourse, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, I'll say just one thing about that, which is kind of revealing some inside information. But I think now that like Douglas kind of started this by going off on this, going off about how he told Rogan he didn't really want me to be there, and Rogan insisted that I would be there, and which I gotta say again, I just find to be like embarrassing. I'm not like trying to just personally attack the guy, but like, dude, you agreed to the debate. I've never in my life, man, like I've done so many of these debates, more than Douglas Murray, and I've never in my life started whining after one that it was unfair who the moderator was or who the debate opponent was. Like, we're all adults here. You agreed to this, like whatever. And look, I don't know what the conversation exactly was between Joe and Douglas, but I do know the one thing that I was told from Rogan was that Douglas's the only request that he had was that this be a civil exchange of ideas and we not devolve into like a food fight. And I was like, great, that's exactly what I want to do. And yet in the debate and in the post-debate, in his post-debate comments about this, again, the entire thing is about my character. It's never a comment on a single point that I was making, a single argument that I presented. And so there's a certain point, like, look, man, I'm a little bit older than you. I say a little bit to be kind to myself. But I'm, maybe I've been a little more hardened by this game, but in my heart of hearts, I have that same attitude you have. Like, let's not insult each other, guys. Let's all like really talk about the issue. I mean, the issues are what matter. None of our obviously we all have egos and that gets in the way of stuff. But like what really matters is the stuff we're talking about, which is really important. The COVID policies or war policies, this is really important. This is going to affect millions of people's lives. But it's hard when throughout the whole show and in all the post-show comments, when it's just a comment on my character, it's hard after a while to not respond back with being like, screw you guys. Like who, and then kind of breaking down their hypocrisies. So, whatever. I'll tell you, I've seen of this. You were the one, you mentioned this to me a few weeks ago, or you sent me some of it. I think I saw a clip or two of Sam Harris and Douglas Murray, but I don't think I've seen a lot of the clips you're about to play.
Yeah.
So I'll try my best to just have an honest reaction and take on the arguments that they're presenting.
Yeah. No, I agree with you, and we'll get into that. I consumed about 3 to 4 hours yesterday in preparation for this. I watched fully the Sam Douglas podcast. I watched Douglas on a few other podcasts, and not 100%, but like 80 to 90% of Douglas's comments about you are that you're a comic and you're not qualified, and you go to Wikipedia, you have yet to say something funny, and yada yada yada. And I was consuming so many hours. I'm like, okay, I'm on like hour number 3 of just watching him on podcast talk about Dave. And he mentions a couple, and we'll get into a couple things about the blockade. He thinks you're wrong about that, and you haven't been there. I mean, that's another kind of argument he says over and over again. But there's not like I don't hear him at all really, with some very few rare exceptions, talk about the substance of your arguments. But it's just remarkable how that is happening.
Well, I'm glad you noticed. I don't think you're the only one, but yeah.
Yeah, and then to what you just said about Rogan, if I were to try to steelman him, I think he's upset that he didn't get a full 3-hour interview the way you frequently get with Rogan, and he's upset why he didn't just get that 3 hours, why he frames it emotional support monkey, emotional support animal that Joe needed. He's upset why he just couldn't just say all his claims without being challenged for 3 hours. And he's like, I was given 4 or 5 days notice or whatever. So he's very upset about that.
Oh, that's not true. That's not true. There was substantially more than 4 or 5 days notice. That I know for sure. That was this was booked. I'm trying to remember offhand, but it was at least several weeks out that we booked it. Yeah,
with you involved?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. No, I had, but if you remember, I went on, which is a point Douglas has made a bunch, but I went on like a week before the debate. I did like a solo episode, and then we booked that. I just remember, and I would have to go through my text and like check, but it was Joe called me about doing the Douglas Murray thing. I accepted immediately. A few days later, Douglas accepted, and then I called Joe and I was like, hey, so I assume we'll do this instead of, because we already had the one on the books that I did. I was like, I assume we'll do this instead of me doing the podcast, right? Like, do you really want me there back-to-back weeks? And Joe was like, no, you know what? Let's just keep it. We already have it booked. And he goes, it'll be a different podcast than the one with Douglas anyway, so it'll be fine. Let's keep it. So I know for a fact it was at least weeks before. It was not a few days before that he got the notice. But on top of that, it's like, look, man, again, it's just, this is so lame and for a thing for him to be whining about. Look, obviously, he would have preferred to not have me there challenging him, and he would have preferred to just go on Rogan and give his talking points and not have the pushback from me or whatever. And like, yeah, clearly Rogan wanted to do it like this. Nobody is owed a Joe Rogan appearance. Joe Rogan gets to decide who he wants to have on his show. And obviously, yeah, like I don't think I'm giving anything away here. I think Joe would say this publicly. I think Joe was uncomfortable with the idea of just having Douglas on to promote his advocacy for this war, because this war is so horrible and killing innocent people. And so he was like, I'd rather host like a back and forth, conversation with someone on each side. Again, I just don't understand, like if Joe said to me tomorrow that he's been convinced that I'm not really right about the stuff that I've been talking about, and he didn't want to have me on again alone. He wanted to have me there with someone debating, pushing back against me. I would just be like, all right, well, I still got the opportunity to go on Joe Rogan's show and make my case. I wouldn't sit there bitching about it. I don't know. Like, it's just, this is weak. This is so weak.
Yeah. And as we'll get into, I mean, it was anything but a smackdown on his part. And I was commenting in response to this guy, Jeffrey Miller, who's an evolutionary psychologist, and he was calling you out. And I'm like, the fact that Douglas didn't just absolutely destroy him is a point towards the anti-establishment. Even if you disagree with Dave, let's just say, the fact that you were actually responding to him in real time and it seemed like an even battle. It didn't seem like Douglas was just exposing your fallacies or whatever. Is incredible in and of itself.
Well, he kind of screwed himself over. And that's why it was. Look, I mean, Douglas. It was what Douglas did in the debate was a strategy. It was a strategy for a reason. I understand why he pursued that strategy, because he didn't want to just have the debate about the topic. Now, the problem is that he screwed himself over, because when you spend the first 45 minutes talking about how you're an expert and all these other people aren't experts, well, then once we get into the debate, you really better demonstrate that. Like, then you're putting more and more of an onus on yourself that, like, you should just be smashing this guy. You know, if I go debate someone, and I've done a lot of these debates where I've clearly read 10 times more about this subject than the person I'm debating. But if I were to just open the debate by going, I've read so much more than this person, I know so much more than you, you're just you're just raising the bar for your own performance. Now you have, but so if I start the debate going, I've read 10 times more than you, and then I get into the debate and I'm not smashing this guy, then it just looks very bad for me. And, you know, by Douglas's own argument here, he should have been thrilled at this opportunity. Like, if you're saying that Rogan is having all these people on who are non-experts, who are spreading misinformation, and they're being presented as if they're experts, but they're not really experts, well, then you just got the opportunity to come in and smack down the number one, or one of the main ones, maybe the one who's on the most, I don't know. So, like, one, you know, maybe I shouldn't say I'm the number one guy, because they probably hate Daryl and the other people more than me, but like, I've been on a lot more than Daryl has. And so, like, it's like, oh, so here's your opportunity where you could have come in, right? And just, you should be able to win the day, have such superior arguments to me that the entire audience is going, oh man, now I see the difference between a professional and an amateur. Joe Rogan is sitting there going, oh man, now I've been listening a little bit too much to my comic buddy who seems to make some good points, but I just saw the really good points. Except the problem is, he can't do that because I'm right about this. So it's not even that I'm not smarter than Douglas Murray. I'm not better educated than Douglas Murray. I know what I'm talking about, and I'm right about this. So he knows he can't do that. And so he had to do this thing that a lot of people do when they're on the wrong side of an argument, where they almost try to just, like, mind control, like, they try to convince you that they are doing that without doing it. I'm so much better than this guy. I could beat the shit out of him. I don't even have to fight him. That, you know what I mean? Like, why would I even fight him? It's ridiculous that I did fight. It was like, dude, I'm standing here with my hands up. Let's fight. You don't want to do that.
And in this, we're going to play from the Michael Moynihan podcast, which is the most recent one. In there, they said, well, I think Michael said, is this like the first debate Joe's done, or one of the first debates? Like, he doesn't do debates that often. He doesn't do debates all the time, but he has done debates before, and they clearly didn't really know about that, which, again, just shows they don't really, they're not fully informed on these things. But there's one really good debate. It was Alex Berenson versus Mike Hart, both people I've had on the podcast, both friends. It was a debate on cannabis, and Joe is very pro cannabis. He uses cannabis, and by the end of the debate, and since the debate, several times he actually credits Alex and says, Alex brought to my attention a lot of concerns about cannabis, particularly for young people, particularly for young men. Issues surrounding psychosis or schizophrenic breaks, and it's not for everyone, and can't just say everyone should be on pot. But the Joe's obvious bias was pro cannabis going into the debate, and he still is pro cannabis, but he saw Alex was making some really good points about some of the risks that should be talked about. And so it's not that, you know, Joe is just completely inflexibly anti-Israel by any stretch. Like, if Douglas was making great points, I think Joe would have fairly credited Douglas with making fair points. And the other thing too about Douglas keeps saying over and over again that Joe hasn't had on anyone, or at least not many pro-Israel people. I mean, you did a whole breakdown of Coleman Hughes on Rogan's podcast, advocating for the pro-Israel position. They've also had on Konstantin Kisin and Francis Foster, Konstantin, who you've debated on Ukraine. They're also pro-Israel. Gad Saad, pro-Israel. Jordan Peterson. I don't think Jordan talks much about that, but he's at least pro-Israel. A number of other people too. There's this guy, I forget his name, but he's a documentarian, and he had a great documentary, I think last year, on the Hare Krishna movement. this Hindu ideology. And he was talking about, he went to Ukraine, this guy, this journalist, documentarian, and he was very much on the side of supporting Ukraine, and he articulated his position on the podcast. So many examples of, and there's many other
Oh yeah, a
examples.
ton.
There's
A ton.
a ton.
Yeah, and over the years, I mean, since the most recent, like post October 7th, I think he's had Mike Baker on a couple times, but over the years, I mean, had Ben Shapiro on, he's had a ton of people, and then also, so number one, the claim is wrong, like objectively, it is not true that he hasn't had people on who are arguing the pro-Israeli point of view, but then also, like, it's a ridiculous standard that he must have an equal amount of people who are pro and critical Israel. Why is that? Joe definitely had more pro-Trump people than pro-Kamala Harris people, but you don't see Douglas Murray complaining about that because he agrees with that. See, when he agrees with it, it's not a problem. You don't see him complaining that Bill Maher and Dave Rubin are pro-Israel. He's not going, oh my God, they're not experts. Oh my God, they don't know about this or that. You know what I'm saying? It's like, no, the issue is that people who don't agree with you are being allowed to speak. And this is one of the things that I think has really woken a lot of people up and made a lot of people kind of re-question. I can't tell you how many messages, both from like very well-known people and just from random, people who listen to the show, how many messages I've got of people who were like, oh, dude, I was a huge fan of all these guys, Douglas Murray or Sam Harris or whoever, and now I just can't believe they're going down this route because it's just so transparent. It's like, oh, you don't even really believe in this. They're all essentially look, I mean, I'm not trying to strawman any of what they're saying. We get into the clips and stuff, but it's essentially a cancellation campaign. Now, I'm not like trying to act like I'm a victim or something because it's not working. And I don't think there's any chance of it working. I think I'm in a fine spot right now, but it's like, they're all sitting there saying what? Essentially that me and Daryl Cooper and Ian Carroll and guys like this shouldn't be platformed, that Joe Rogan shouldn't be having us on. Now, they're not advocating necessarily that like big tech kick us off, but it certainly is in the same spirit of like, we shouldn't be hearing from these guys. And I just think that it's like that time is over, man. And in this new time, you got to make an argument. You got to take on the stuff that we're saying.
Yeah. Well, I really want to get to the clips, but we're talking about a lot of important things still. Dave Rubin quickly wanted to say that you guys are going back and forth about a potential debate. I want to hear how that happened, and just want to say one thing about Dave. Also, like all these guys, I've met Dave personally multiple times. I've been on his show. Nice guy, generous guy. I like him personally. But he said a couple things around this issue surrounding free speech that I was very concerned about. Just pulled up here a tweet where France banned pro-Palestine protests on October 12th, 2023. And then Dave responds with, maybe the West has a chance. And like stuff like that, where it's like, this goes against the whole free speech thing. Like, come on, guys. You guys were talking about this for years about now not deplatforming, suppressing people with alternate viewpoints on COVID or Trump or identity politics, transgender issues. But when it comes to pro-Palestine protests and discussion, there's suddenly this censorious ideology that's arising within conservatism.
Yeah, so I just saw because someone sent it to me. And listen, I've met Dave Rubin a bunch of times, and I've always gotten along with him, and we've always been nice to each other. He's always said nice things about me, and like I've never. Someone sent me a thing where he like unfollowed me on social media. I noticed like at post October.
He also
7th.
unfollowed me.
I was kind of like, yeah, but I was kind of like, all right, I don't really. That's fine. I wouldn't like if you don't want to hear what I have to say or whatever. We're on different sides of this issue. That's fine. But someone sent me a thing where he was going
by the way, I don't know why you unfollowed me. I barely talk about that issue. A couple of times I said some of the free speech. I've only ever said to the extent of the free speech attacks. I've never said anything pro-Israel, anti-Israel, pro-Ukraine. I'm not a foreign policy guy, so I stay out of it. When it comes to free speech, I'm like, hey, okay, people who are pro-Palestine should have their perspectives heard, and they shouldn't be their protests shouldn't be banned. And I think maybe for that I've been unfollowed potentially.
I guess. Well, no, I saw. So someone sent me a thing where he was basically just talking shit. Like he was like, Dave's a dummy. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Like, well, so then it's like, look, the reason I do this is like, because I believe what I'm saying. And like, I care about the issues that I talk about and that I like, delivering them in the most compelling way that I can. But this is also what I do for a living. This is also we're in like media of some sort. And so when Dave Rubin is out there like insulting me, he's got millions of followers, he's telling his audience this guy is an idiot, he doesn't know what he's talking about. I feel almost like I don't have that many tools in my tool bag. So, but the one I do have is that, hey, I got a big following at this point too. So if you're trying to weaponize this audience against me, then I'm going to get in there and I go, hey, Dave. So I challenged him and I go, hey, dude, why don't we sit down and have a conversation? Since I don't know what I'm talking about. Maybe we'll see which one of us doesn't know what he's talking about. Okay. And then he accepted. And now he's just ghosted everybody. He won't respond to anyone. So he said he accepted, then he got challenged. It's all set up and ready to go, but he doesn't want to do it now because he knows it'll go bad for him. And like, again, it's like I said before, I get put in this situation and then I'm like, well, am I not supposed to comment now on Dave Rubin's character or his intelligence or whatever? Like, if I'm being honest, I've always thought Dave Rubin was a nice enough guy. I've never had anything but nice interactions with him. That being said, if he wants to sit here and say I'm a dummy who doesn't know what I'm talking about, I think Dave Rubin is one of the most low information commentators in this space, to be honest. He's famous for his, as far as I know, his two most viral moments were the thing with Larry Elder when he started a conversation about systemic racism and was not armed with, he was literally not armed with the liberal or conservative perspective on that. Larry Elder presented to him not anything unique that Larry Elder had just made up, what was the standard conservative response to these claims for at least 3 decades before them. This blew Dave Rubin's mind because he had never heard of them. And he didn't even have the liberal counters to any of them available in his mind. So he just sat there being like, wow, golly gee, you just blew my mind. It's that. And then I remember his moment with Rogan where he was arguing for the libertarian case, the side that I agree on, and made the absolute worst libertarian argument for lack of building regulations that I've ever heard in my life. His argument was essentially just that, nah, these builders are good guys. They'd never do nothing like that. And like, it was just, so like, I don't know. I don't have moments like that in my career. That's not like what I'm known for. So like whatever. If Dave Rubin wants to debate, we can. If he doesn't, I don't really care. It's already now been like, I think he's not going to want to do that. It would not go good for him. But again, it's like, I just feel like I'm in a situation where it's like, if all these guys want to come, sure.
I hope he doesn't.
Listen, I'm on too many goddamn airplanes and I sleep in too many hotel rooms. So if I don't have to go do one more, I'm fine with that too. But I'll get on a plane to go debate Dave Rubin. It's no problem. I said I'd do it in his backyard. Let's do it.
Yeah. On Patrick Bet-David's show, I think you proposed. Yeah, I'd love to see that. By the way, there has been this general trend. Glenn Greenwald has talked about this, where he's invited so many Israel supporters on his show and they just won't accept. I think he named Dave as one. Dave Rubin, Coleman Hughes, Douglas Murray, others as well, who he's invited on the show to come on and voice their perspective, and they just don't take him up on it, which is just ridiculous. All right, okay, let's get into this. So we're going to play a clip from the recent Michael Moynihan, Douglas Murray podcast, and then we're going to get into the Sam podcast.
Natasha's a real gem and a real knowledge, a real store of knowledge.
Yeah.
She went on with a comedian, and not only was she treated as having parity in her views with the comedian, she was actually treated as less than. And at one point, Piers turned to Comic Dave, who he allowed to just run and run and run, whereas Natasha Hausdorff was not allowed to get a sentence out uninterrupted by Piers. At one point, Piers turned to Comic Dave and said, she's treating us like we're clowns. Well, what is he, your guest? He's a self-described clown. His job is to say funny, funny, funny stuff. So don't go on shows introduced as a comedian and then complain that somebody thinks you're a clown. What do you think you are? There's a complete... And the most distressing thing about that is, as I say, is not the parity. Fine, everyone's got their own views. Everyone's welcome to extol them. But to regard the international lawyer as not on an equal footing, but less than a comedian who knows nothing about this, is a sign of the further degradation, which I will continue to oppose it. I do not approve of it. I do not like it. I don't think there's anything good that can come from it. And I'm sorry that more people can't say that. And I think they can't say it largely because a large number of people owe or think they owe their celebrity or reach or something to people who are pushing really bad.
All right, so I want to get your response in a second, but to me, just the level of condescension of like comedian, comic, international lawyer, and the fact that Pierce is not viewing them equally, but viewing the comic as of being superior, like it's like he's filtering through your professions, not the actual argumentation. And I thought you had better arguments in that conversation. But he's just filtering through what are their qualifications. And like in theory, international lawyer over comedian, you could win. And Sam makes this point we'll get into in the podcast. You could win money all day with, doctor versus guy in his basement reading studies or whatever. And, obviously, but again, you're applying this broad general principle that people who are experts are usually, well, in some cases at least, often more right than the guy in his basement who's just, going rogue and reading his own stuff. But he's not actually addressing any of the arguments that you made. And instead it's like he's upset that that the comedian is being favored over the international lawyer.
Dude, I mean, I don't even know what to say. It's just rambling nonsense, absent anything that could even be approaching an argument. Like, I'm sorry, what's so crazy is that this is the stuff that Douglas Murray, when he's battling with the woke left, this is the stuff that he tears through. Like, where there isn't actually an argument, you're just rambling. At one point, it's like he's figuring it out as he goes. Like, he's doing this thing where, like, it's just so obvious and cheap, but like, he goes, you literally are a clown. Your title is comedian. And then you start complaining when people call you a clown. I didn't complain about anyone calling me a clown. What are you talking about? You're complaining about Pierce calling your friend a clown. Now, obviously, if you just want to presume the conclusion and go, well, why is it that Pierce is arguing with this lady? Well, I wasn't spewing lies at Pierce. And he didn't appreciate the way she was. Dude, the stuff she was saying was insulting to his intelligence. She also, much like Douglas, she accepted the debate and then opened it by going at the moderator and then got upset when the moderator wasn't on their side. I mean, like, I don't know. The reason why Pierce was so furious with her is that she was saying things like, the reason Israel won't let reporters into Gaza is because they're worried about their safety. And it's just like, dude, this is so ridiculous. It's insulting. It's insulting for that to even be the lie that you're using to cover this up. Like, oh yeah, exactly. That's why, as we all know, when powerful organizations won't allow people to see what they're doing, it's always because they're very concerned for the people who might expose what they're doing. It's just, anyway, again, what Douglas is really attacking here, he won't admit this. I know I've seen him say, I think it's his guilty conscience getting to him, but at certain points he's like, I'm not against the marketplace of ideas. I thrive in it. It's like, well, no, actually you don't. Actually, you can't thrive in it. You need a controlled space. And that's what you're upset about. The reason I'm here is purely through the marketplace. I didn't have any institution behind me. I didn't have any nation behind me. I don't have any UK Lawyers for Israel group behind me. I didn't have any USAID money coming into me. What I had was a microphone and a laptop. And I just kept making really good points until I built myself up to be the guy who are debating these people. Sorry if you hate the marketplace, but now you have to debate. Or your other option is don't accept the debate. Run and hide. I've had more respect for these two if they just ran from the debate and refused to do it. But to engage in the debate and then do this whining, like, it's so unfair that we're all on equal footing. But it's just,
yeah.
Listen, man, I don't know if you saw this one, but the one time I was on Piers Morgan, where it was the most hostile toward me, was like right after.
Jordan Spencer. Is that his name?
No, not that one.
Is that his name?
No, that one I thought was
the military conflict expert.
Yeah, something like that.
He was trying to school you.
I thought
that podcast again was so. He's like, here, I'm the professor. Let me teach you something. Like, get in the classroom here, buddy. It was just that tone is just, it's not working for these people, and they keep doing it.
Yeah, no, but I was talking. That's right. I agree. But
think
I was
John
talking
Spencer
about
might
the
be his
one. There was the what's his name? Andrew. Damn, I'm blanking on his name. But it was the House of Lords. The House of Lords historian. Hold on, I'll get his name right here. It's Andrew something. I'm sorry. I'm just bad with names. But sorry, I'll find it in a second. But
Yeah,
so
good.
I went on. So it was right after Daryl Cooper had that thing on Tucker Carlson that went super viral, and where he was saying the thing about Churchill and being the real villain in World War II. And so I went on Piers the next day. It's by the way, they didn't tell me that I was just to be on a panel, and they told me I was on with one of the guys from Babylon Bee, and then it's Pierce, the Babylon Bee guy, and
Seth
world-renowned Seth Dillon, yes,
Yeah.
and who I like, and world-renowned historian, expert on World War II, 3-on-1 against me, and Pierce was just like not buying any of my lines, and he just thought the whole thing was crazy. I just kind of sat there. I tried my best to argue my case. A lot of them they were all 3-against-1, beating up on me. But it's like, I don't know. You take your lumps, you argue your case, and you move on.
Yeah. I did see that, by the way. I
Whining.
forget the exact specifics, but I did watch that. I remember. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just like the thing of whining for weeks and months after the fact. It's like, I don't know, it's people will say all the people on Twitter who have Hebrew letters in their name and a Israeli flag in their bio, who are all, anytime I talk about this, they're like, look at Dave still going on about the debate, he's still trying to, hang on to it or something. But I'm talking about it because you want to talk.
Yeah.
I'm quite happy with how it went. I'm quite happy with this. I'm not whining and complaining about how it was all so unfair.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so we're gonna go to the Sam Harris podcast now, and that's gonna bring up, I think, all any best case scenario. If you want to try and steel man the other side, it's gonna bring up all the arguments that they have, and so we're gonna go through them systematically.
Everyone, when they get on an airplane, wants their pilot to be a real pilot, not just one who's LARPing as a pilot or who's self-taught, in a simulator they have at home. Unless they don't want to land the plane, right? In which case, unless they're jihadists, but let's leave that aside.
Yeah, if you go into for brain surgery and just before you're wheeled into the operating theater, comic Dave Smith appears and says, "I'm doing the task."
Yeah. I'm not an expert, but
I never claimed to be an expert, but I am carrying out the operation.
Yes, yeah. I've got a free 4 hours. I'll be inside your head. Okay, so there is just simply indisputable that there's in any domain that matters, and certainly in any domain that purports to be in touch with reality, any side of it, whether it's journalism, history, science, or just how to get things done, just physically, whether you're a plumber or not a plumber, right? The difference between knowing something or knowing nearly everything and knowing nothing is extraordinary, and it matters insofar as the topic matters. And so in that context, you can see that a consensus among experts is rather often meaningful, right? So if you have the lone person who's going against the consensus, if 99% of the specialists in a field believe X, and you've got somebody believing Y, maybe somebody who is himself an expert, he has the right credentials. But certainly in the case of someone who isn't an expert and doesn't have the right credentials, it is more often than not the case that you're not in the presence of a lone genius who's just figured everything out on his own. You're very likely in the presence of somebody who's mistaken.
All right, so Dave, tell me, you go for brain surgery, you're in the operating theater, you go in, you're laying down, and you see comic Dave Smith is here to surgically operate on your brain.
Yeah, well, it's I guess this is something approaching an argument, so I'll give them kind of credit for that, but it's the weakest disanalogy. I mean, by this same logic, it would disqualify these two guys from talking about 90% of what they talk about. Like 90% of the stuff that both of them talk about, they are not, in this analogy, the surgeon. But obviously, it's a little bit different. Yes, obviously, if you're having surgery, if you're having someone defuse a bomb, there's a very specific credential that would go along with, before you would want someone to complete that task or even attempt to that task. But this is totally different than issues of morality and government policy. The idea that, say, like, if would you in 1840 would you be arguing that a regular person can't oppose slavery and they can't speak out against slavery? Oh, you're not an economist. You don't even understand how cotton picking would work absent slave labor. Like, really? I mean, if you want to take this to its logical conclusion, then I guess none of us can really talk about any of the issues that we talk about all the time, including you two. I'm sorry, Sam Harris is out there talking about COVID vaccines. What you know what I'm saying? Like, what expertise does he have to talk about that? Douglas Murray has been writing books advocating for wars since he was in his early 20s.
Yeah.
What?
With a degree in English.
Yes, with a degree in English, advocating for war. Okay? And yet you'll turn around and tell other people when they can and can't talk about something. By the way, Douglas Murray was of age to enter wars as these wars were going on, but instead he chose to write books about how other people should go sacrifice their kids or themselves in these wars. And so I just mentioned that. So just right away, it completely falls apart and makes both of them the biggest hypocrites in the world. So I appreciate them putting forth something that approaches an argument, because it's so easy to slap it down with a superior argument. But on top of that, is it not the most anti-democratic in spirit argument? I mean, if people aren't qualified to talk about these things, then how can they possibly vote for leaders who are going to enact policies on these things? Wouldn't the argument then be that nobody except the expert class ought to be able to vote in elections? And then on top of that, I would just add that, what they're doing here, again, which is very similar to woke progressives, because I think deep down they both are woke progressives. But what they're doing, if you'll notice, it's the exact same argument against free speech. The argument the argument for people like me and you who believe in free speech, our argument has never been that therefore bad opinions won't be heard, or therefore people who aren't really qualified to have these opinions won't have them. The point of why we believe in free speech, or at least one of the major reasons, is because you go, well, who gets to pick? Who gets to be the person who decides which speech you're allowed to hear and which speech you're not allowed to hear? It's just like with all the advocacy for speech restrictions and all of the advocacy for government programs in general. They always love to pretend as if there's not a flawed person on that part of the calculation as well. And so, it's so funny, because as I'm sitting here, look, the fact is that I'm not, unlike these two, I don't pretend to be an expert. It's ironic because that's the thing they're kind of accusing me of doing, but they're the ones who are guilty of it, not me. I don't pretend to be an expert, but the fact is that there are people who are substantially smarter than me, who have substantially more expertise than me, who aren't as good at making this argument as I am. And so that there's, a lot of times people do debates, Douglas Murray included. He's not the best expert, but he's rhetorically very talented. So he's very good at making the case that other people have far more expertise in than him. And the truth is that there are experts all over the world who agree with me on the Israel-Palestine. Yeah. Now, there's also experts who disagree with me, like the guy whose book I just held up before that I was reading. Benny Morris is a legit expert who does not agree with me. And I'm still reading his book because I've read several of his and they're very good. But so the point is, you just can't disqualify people like this. It's like the through line through all of this stuff is, like I said before, anything to avoid addressing one of my arguments. They do anything but that.
So the reason why we're doing this podcast, and we've been trying to do this for a few weeks, and there were some delays and things like that, but the reason why we're doing this podcast is because there is a real problem here that is worth dissecting and worth talking about rationally. And I think that part of the problem here is that what Sam and Douglas are saying about this problem of people who don't know what they're talking about, then chiming in on issues, that does exist, and I've seen it before. So let's just get that out.
Yeah.
So that is a thing. And COVID, and actually Jay Bhattacharya and I, we talked about this on the podcast, and Jay Bhattacharya just did Andrew Huberman's podcast, and Andrew asked him some very basic questions to to just lay a foundation of like, do you believe some vaccines are good? And Jay's like, yes. Do you think some vaccines save lives? And Jay's like, yes. And then do some vaccines harm people or are net harmful? And Jay's like, yeah, the COVID vaccine, particularly for young people. And there's all this feedback. People want Jay to be more anti-vax than he is, and some people obviously want to be more pro-vaccine than he is. People who are super pro-mRNA shots. But there was this problem during COVID where a sizable amount of people were so rightly distrustful of what the authorities got wrong on COVID that they were just willing to just throw everything out the door. And like no vaccine could ever be good. Generally, any kind of medical treatment, they were skeptical of everything. And generally, you should be skeptical, but there were people that went way too far, right? I'm sure you would agree with that. And there was 100%, and there was conspiratorial thinking. There's people that I know, people I've talked to, people that I'm actually close with too in my personal life who I disagree with, but believe that the COVID vaccine was part of a genocidal program to kill people and inject some kind of 5G software that was going to be monitored by the Mossad and Israel, and these WHO were collaborating to, spreading transhumanism and this and that, and like all these like crazy connections, and people who say that often get a lot of viral clicks, and the hot viral salacious content like that gets a lot of views, whereas the more moderate Jay Bhattacharya and I, which we were trying to do, like, hey, here's what the establishment's getting wrong, but hey, we're also not saying vaccines cause autism. Yes, it should be investigated more, which is his line now. Jay's talking about. He's always been consistent about that. But we're not going to say all vaccines are part of some genocidal program. You should never ever get any vaccine. Never ever trust your doctor. So that is a real problem that Sam and Douglas are talking about. It sounds like you agree with that. But the thing is, they're applying that, and they talk about Daryl Cooper and Tucker and all these other people, but they are applying that problem to you as like you're indicative of that problem. But I don't think you're indicative of that problem at all. And so while there is this general problem of increase in conspiracy thinking, I don't think you're an example of that. And they don't really, we'll get into some of the clips, but Douglas has not really made any clear points of where, Dave is saying this, here's why this is absolute BS. Here's me fact checking him. Here are the sources. Here's why he's wrong. This is conspiratorial balderdash. By the way, he calls you a contrarian conspiracist in the Michael Moynihan podcast. I've yet to see any argument where he's like, oh, here's Dave's conspiratorial opinion. I haven't seen that. And so it's really all just very fallacious.
So just a couple things on that. Yes, number one, I do agree with you. And yeah, it's a problem that we have. People are very, and this is one of the problems of trust in institutions being shattered, is that people are very quick to jump to some really wild conspiracy theorists that just are not borne out by the facts. And it's very easy. It's very seductive, conspiracy theorists, because it's kind of this amazing story. And it's also, it offers you something like psychologically. It's this amazing story and you're in on it. A lot of other people are fooled, but you're the one who really sees the truth. And that is a problem. That also is a problem that both me and Joe agreed with Douglas on at the very beginning of the debate. Like, yes, we agree with you. That is a problem. The next step, though, is you have to demonstrate how I'm a part of that. You don't get to just say that's a problem and then go, see, and Dave's that. When you had an opportunity to debate me and didn't demonstrate any of that. And by the way, the only other thing I would say is that, yes, it is true that that's a problem. The problem objectively pales in comparison to the lies that have been spread from the highest halls of power. So yes, it is true that it's a problem that there might be people who are like, whatever, think that Dick Cheney did 9/11 or something like that. And they don't really have good evidence to back that up. But it's a much bigger problem that Dick Cheney and George W. Bush lied through their teeth and said that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction when they knew he didn't, and got 1 million people killed for no reason. That's actually a much bigger problem. So it was a big problem that there were random people who thought ivermectin was a cure-all for COVID, which is not what anyone sensible was ever arguing. Yes, and now, that's a big problem. But a much, much bigger problem was the government declaring that lockdowns were going to slow the spread when in fact they didn't slow the spread and just destroyed a lot of people's lives, or insisting on kicking people out of schools or firing them from their job for not taking a vaccine that they didn't need to take anyway. That was more of a risk than a benefit for them.
Kicking out college students who didn't get their booster. Many universities mandated the booster, which made no sense at all.
So, like, I'm sorry, like, it is true that there is a problem with some of the young boys on the internet taking things a little bit too far. And certainly I've always been a voice encouraging them to really have a solid foundation for the views that they're developing. But I just have a bit of a tough time when it's people like Douglas Murray and Sam Harris who are not criticizing, first and foremost, the institutions that have purveyed so much more consequentially damaging misinformation. And in the case, at least, of Sam Harris, when it comes to COVID, and Douglas Murray, when it comes to war, have been participants in it, propagandists of the regime in these efforts. So I'm sorry, those guys, I just feel like, don't even have a right. And I don't say this as a libertarian natural rights thing. I just mean, like, they shouldn't even be talking about the misinformation on the internet. Like, we got much bigger problems than that.
Yeah. I mean, this is a really important point. Again, misinformation is a problem, and there are people with massive audiences online engaging in conspiracy thinking, and you see it on Twitter. People who have the hottest takes about what's happening with geopolitics and like making all these crazy connections, and there is this rise in anti-Semitic rhetoric where people just want to blame the Jews for everything. Like all of that is true, but this is a really important point about measuring and comparing those two problems that you laid out: institutions lying, spreading misinformation, versus now very large people with very large audiences online spreading misinformation. Both problems are real. All of us, Douglas, Sam, and you and I agree with that. I'm remembering now Dr. Vinay Prasad. He had some great commentary during COVID. He's not part of the FDA. And so he was one of these doctors. It was like Vinay, Marty McCary, who's now head of the FDA, Tracy Beth Hogue, who's also part of the FDA. It's like all these like people who we banded together during COVID, and we were doing Substacks and podcasts, are now at the NIH, HHS, FDA. Vinay was one of these people. He was very pro-vaccine, generally recommended actually the COVID vaccine, but he was ringing the alarms on myocarditis and about mandates and things like that. And I always appreciated his line and agreed with when he was doing these very strong videos talking about things happening with COVID. He'd be like, okay, yes, there's a problem of misinformation, but look what the FDA is doing. The FDA is not supposed to be promoting COVID shots. Their job is just regulating and improving. And yet the FDA is saying ivermectin's a horse dewormer, which, okay, even if ivermectin's not effective for COVID, saying that is ridiculous. But like, we're recommending these shots. I just did a big interview, by the way, and he's going to come back on. It was a couple months ago now. But Dr. Philip Krause, who was part of the FDA's vaccine approval team, they got a directive from the White House to the head of the FDA that they wanted to accelerate the approval of the mRNA shots because they wanted to mandate it explicitly for the military. And the FDA commissioner goes to Philip Krause, and this is the first podcast interview he had done with me. I had to chase him down for like a year. He's a very quiet guy, doesn't like media. I was talking to him about it, and he's like, I said, we need some time here. We can't review the vaccine right away. And he said, we need a little bit more time. We can't do this in a couple weeks or whatever time it was. And they sidelined him, the head of the FDA, Peter Marks, who was in charge of all this stuff. They sidelined him and another scientist because they wanted to approve the vaccines as soon as possible to appease the White House so they could mandate it. And so stuff like that, it's like, okay, yes, misinformation is a problem. Yes, these annoying, stupid people saying there's a vaccine genocide happening are weirdly getting large audiences online, and people are believing this stuff. Clearly, I see people believing that stuff. But is that really the bigger problem? Or is the bigger problem that the FDA was sidelining vaccine experts and saying we want to approve the vaccine as soon as possible? And when experts like Philip Krause were saying that there's not enough evidence for widely approving the boosters, this is the other thing, he was saying the booster should not be recommended in young people. We should be very careful in recommending this. Yet again, sidelined. Then he ended up resigning because he wasn't able to do his scientific job at the FDA. It's like, that's a really interesting, important, concerning story that people like Sam Harris and Douglas Murray weren't talking about really. And instead it was pushing the mRNA shots and blaming, Joe Rogan for spreading misinformation, when the far bigger story was how the NIH, Fauci, FDA, CDC, HHS, how all these people were spreading misinformation during the pandemic.
Yeah, dude, and listen, I know, like you said, like this is kind of the world you live in, and you don't like specialize in the foreign policy stuff as much.
Well, I'd like to specialize. I'm learning still, so I'm very honest about. Yeah.
Well, I'm just
Yeah.
I'm just telling you, as somebody who's really done deep dives on both of the things, it's the exact same dynamic with the warfare machine, dude. It's the exact same thing where these weapons companies are making like ungodly amounts of money. Then they're funding think tanks, and the think tanks go to DC and lobby for another war based off all of these lies that they know are lies, like stuff that they know is not true. It happens over and over and over again. And so it's like the same type of dynamic where you're like, yeah, okay, there might be like some conspiracy theory online that's like, yeah, I don't think this is exactly right. I've seen lots of those conspiracies about
thinking online.
Yes, sure. But at the same time, the real conspiracy that's actually out there is the one that's resulted in like 7 destroyed nations and millions of people just being killed when they didn't need to, and has drained our treasury of like $8 trillion. So when you hear somebody who's been supporting all those policies talking about like, it's a real problem that there's some people who have these conspiracies, it's like, even though there is some kernel of truth to what they're saying, it's like, yeah, dude, but you're totally like, by like having the hugest omission of what the real scandal here is.
Yeah, so it's a matter of emphasis and how much importance you're placing.
Yeah.
So they are pointing out a real problem, but they're not talking about some of the bigger problems. And
yes, and then they're also doing the thing where they're, personally to me, what they're doing is what everybody who's ever been like an advocate for censoring speech does, which I'm sure you were young, but I think this is probably around the time that you were getting involved in all these things. But if you remember the knock on Jordan Peterson and people like that when he was standing up to the woke insanity was he's alt-right adjacent. Right? You know how there's all these white nationalists on Twitter? Well, some of them like Jordan Peterson. Therefore, he's in this broader category with all of them. And then you'd be like, yeah, but Jordan Peterson's never said anything white nationalist in his entire life. What are you talking about? But they just go, it's like when you see like, even when Jordan Peterson was having that conversation a week later on Rogan, and he's talking about like the Groypers and the anti-Semites, and hey, who do we platform? Who do we not platform? But when was the last time Joe Rogan platformed a Groyper? Never. That never happened. They're not talking about them. They're using those guys to invoke those guys and then like cast a wider net that like slides you into it too. Again, it's just another tactic. When you don't want to grapple with someone's actual argument, it's another way to just smear them. So they'll go, look, there's all these wild conspiracy theories online. Dave's a part of that. Therefore, he's bad.
Yeah. We're gonna get more into the guilt by association stuff. You're watering certain things in a sec here. Let's play the next clip here.
Who is on the moral high ground without ever having been to either of the respective countries, right? Like you can, you could obviously judge. We could be talking about a war that happened 100 years ago, and be scholars of that conflict. And the burden is not upon either of us to have been to the region.
Well, that was a rather lame point that comic Dave Smith tried to make, which is he said, I haven't been to Nazi Germany either, but can I not have views about that?
Yeah.
As I pointed out to him.
He does have views about that, though.
He does. Certainly does have views about that. But I said, yeah, but I mean, you can't time travel, but you can travel.
Yeah.
And this is, to me, quite an important point, which is that if the reason why it matters in the now is that if you were litigating a foreign conflict or a domestic conflict that happened 100 years ago, much, if not all, of the dust would have settled. You'd be able to get a rounded view of what was happening, what had gone on, and be able to reflect on it. When it's something that is happening now, the dust is not settled by any means, literal or metaphorical, and the consensus view has not emerged. And much, if not most, of the reporting and what that comes out of the region is wildly off. So I don't think it is possible, actually, to simply rely on some published sources. No, I don't think that at all. And I think it is the duty of somebody commenting on such a thing to go and see it firsthand. And that is a journalistic standard. But there we get into the follow-on problem, which is the shapeshifter thing.
All right. Your thoughts?
I gotta say, I am a little bit still, even though I've seen that this is the hill he's going to die on. I'm kind of blown away that Douglas is insisting on, like, dying on this hill. I don't know. That's a kind of a lame. I'm not saying he's actually dying on this, but it's such a weak, pathetic, non-argument, non-point. I don't know what on earth he's like. He said it was a rather lame retort, but I actually think it just disproves his logic that you can comment on a place that you have not been, and the fact that now he's going, which he didn't say in the debate, but now he's going like, well, the consensus has emerged because there's been more time. Okay. By the way, Douglas Murray, again, like with all these incredibly weak points, Douglas is commenting on the war in Iran right now. He's never been there. Now, he'll say, I think he said that he wants to go, but that the regime won't let him in or something. But that doesn't really cancel out his point here. You've still never been, and you're still quite happy to comment on it. And you'll comment on how the Iranian regime is repressive to their own people. But hey, you've never been there, and yet you still comment on this. Well, why is it? Why is it that you're allowed to do that, but I'm not allowed to comment on this? Yeah, look, how do you get, like, again, is he touching on somewhat of a real point? Yeah, it's difficult to get good information in the middle of a war zone that's still ongoing. There's different ways that you do it. There are some reporters who are on the ground. You can rely on video evidence. You can rely on firsthand testimony. You can rely on doctor. Of course, the New York Times had a big piece last year where they had 250 medical professionals who had been in Gaza, all giving their stories. By the way, that article did not come out making Douglas Murray's point look very good. Now did it? But this argument that, first of all, that you have to go somewhere to talk about it is stupid. It's not true. You can learn a lot from going to a place. You can also learn a lot from reading about a place. And you can also, you can also be misinformed by either of those things. You can be misinformed by going to a place and only talking with, say, one group there. And you could really be misinformed by going on a government-sponsored tour of a place, Like if Dennis Rodman's coming back from North Korea and telling you how they have so much food in their supermarkets, he might actually be less informed than somebody who's never been to North Korea but has just read about how the government uses propaganda there. Again, all of this just to avoid taking on the argument. It's like, look, dude, this is like, it's on the level of, I know I've used this analogy before, but it's on the level of like, if two UFC fighters agreed to fight at the big UFC pay-per-view coming up, and then when you get in the cage, you just start going, I trained so much harder than this guy. I'm so much better than him. I'm so much more prepared. Well, okay, but then the point is, then you have to demonstrate that. Then you have to demonstrate what point I'm getting wrong because you've been there. And interestingly enough, the point that Douglas Murray brought this up off of, which was a way to deflect from it because I was hitting him with evidence. But if you actually go back and listen to the debate, listen to what he said. He said there's no deficit of goods going into Gaza. That was his claim. And I went, no deficit? You're telling me the blockade has not kept any goods out at all? And he goes, no. And then went off on his whole thing about, that's just purely bullshit. And nobody who's been there, who's being honest, says that. No expert, even on the pro-Israel side, would dare put that claim in their book because they know it's just not true at all. And so I brought up the thing about the World Bank, and then he pivots to, a libertarian who believes in the World Bank. And it's like, dude, again, all he could do is go to my character. Oh, I'm a hypocrite somehow, which isn't even true. It's not even hypocrisy. Yes, I don't support the World Bank. I also think they are somewhat in the ballpark of correct when they talk about how the impact on GDP of the Israeli blockade around Gaza. Maybe it's not 40% in 1996, like they said. Maybe they got it wrong and it was only 30%, or maybe it was 45%. Yeah. But the point is that it's a real phenomenon. And so again, all of these arguments, first of all, they both end up contradicting their own stated principle. It doesn't even make sense as a general principle. And if you were to reel it back to something that would actually be sound, it would be like, you can gain a lot of insights from traveling to a place. But if you were to say that, who's arguing with you? Now you're just fighting a straw man. Yeah, of course. All right. So, hey, I'll be the first one to concede. That's an advantage for Douglas going in that I don't have. Okay? Yeah. But then you got to use that in the debate. Like training more for a fight is an advantage that you might have over your opponent in a fight, but that doesn't win you any points on the judge's scorecard. You got to go land some punches now, dude. And then, the other thing is that, look, I understand why Douglas Murray's never been to Iran. I understand why Douglas Murray's never been to North Korea, because that's a dangerous proposition for Douglas Murray to go to those countries. He is an enemy of those regimes. Now, it's not a dangerous proposition for him to go on an IDF embedded tour, because they're going to protect him at all costs. Let's not pretend that it's not a different proposition for me to go on an IDF tour than it would be for Douglas Murray to go. Like, if anybody being honest knows that that's the case. And so, again, all just pathetic non-argument.
Yeah, the intellectual sophistry here is just nauseating. Like, it's yes, going to a place gives you an advantage. Yes, if you want to write a book about some place, like he wrote about Strange Death of Europe. He's reporting in Europe, and I thought that was a brilliant book talking about some of the issues with mass immigration. I was in Europe, last year, and I saw just how many people, homeless people, who are clearly not integrated into society. So it's like seeing that is valuable. Before I just read it from Douglas's book, and I went there, and I'm like, oh my God, he's 100% right, and this is a real issue, and I'm seeing it firsthand. Like, everyone agrees with that, and you do get an advantage from that, but that's not how you have a debate, right? You don't go into a debate listing off all the things like, all right, I have a degree in international affairs, okay. I've been to Israel, okay. I've read 20 books, you've read 5, okay. I've talked to 400 families, or whatever, okay. It's like you keep listing off all the things that you've done that give you an advantage. But again, it's like I was saying earlier, there's a general truth to that going to places, you should probably go to a place before talking about it. And there's this other thing as well where Douglas is saying, like, this is your whole thing. You only talk about Israel, and so therefore you should have gone there. But it's like, you talk about Ukraine, you talk about other things too, and then he'll say, well, you haven't been there. But again, just like the general truth about, yes, there's a rise in anti-Semitism, there's a rise in conspiracy thinking, there's a rise in people who don't trust any experts. That's a real problem. But how does that relate to you? It's like, yes, going to a place is an advantage, but how does that apply to Dave Smith and his lack of argumentation? Well, it doesn't really. I didn't see it apply.
Or explain, like, why isn't going there kind of like look, going to a country, certainly, right? So we'd both agree you could gain some insights. We'd probably both agree you could gain some misleading insights, like if you're only seeing one, but like, it'd be real easy to say, like, if you're visiting America and just go to San Francisco and be like, Americans hate Donald Trump. You know what I mean? Like, they all hate Donald Trump. It's like, actually, you got misleading information by going to one specific pocket of America where this is so like, but certainly you could gain insights by going there. But there's lots of ways you could gain insights. It's a little bit arbitrary to just pick that as the one that you're going to go with. Because, like, all I'm saying is, how about being an able-bodied man who's spent 20 years advocating for every single war while serving in none of them? That's a standard that one could use. Maybe you don't get to advocate for other people to go send their kids to fight and die if you're not willing to do the same. Now, I'm not even making that argument. I'm just saying, like, by the same logic, why couldn't you pick other standards of, like, you've never been? You know what I mean? And so it's all just, again, it's weak. It's not
actually,
how you
one other thing
debate.
I'll add to this, it'll be important to add. So in the Michael Moynihan podcast, we're not going to play the clip because we're going through the Sam one, but this is his latest podcast talking about you and the Rogan debate. He's talking about this point again. You've never been there. This is like one. There's like a set of like talking points where it's like, do everything you can to not address Dave's arguments, but try to discredit him. There's like this like operating system where it's like you keep doing the same thing in every podcast, but not actually saying what's wrong about his arguments. Or if he does, there's like a couple things we'll get into about what you're wrong about, which will be more interesting. But he talks about in the podcast, he gives the example like someone in the CCP, someone in China who's writing about American affairs from China and says that, writing virtually that in the United States, black people are still enslaved and it's like the 1860s. And like, well, actually, if you actually were in Los Angeles, you would see that there are equal rights. But you're in China, you don't know what you're talking about. You're just spreading misinformation. And he's like equating that to you being in the United States, talking about Israel and spreading the equivalent of black people are still enslaved in the United States level of propaganda.
But again, you could see where that's just presuming the conclusion. it's arguing. It's like when a trans activist will start the argument by saying that gender and sex are different things, and it's like, no, that's the conclusion. You got to argue that. You don't just get to assume it. So like, my point is that that doesn't actually demonstrate the point he's making, because likewise, the inverse of that is that if someone in China is writing in Mandarin and has never been to the United States of America, and they were to say slavery was abolished in 1865, and then someone in America said slavery is still going on today, the person who's never been would be correct. So it's like, yes, you can come up with an example. When you add into that an incorrect argument, then sure. Then yes, if I'm going to script it that way, then it proves my point. But that's just like that's like on the level of me saying British people are wrong about everything. I mean, just imagine an example of a British person saying the sky is purple, and then an American saying the sky is blue. See, the American gets it right, but that doesn't prove anything. That's like, it doesn't matter. You could get that wrong and have never been, or you could get that right and have never been.
Yeah.
This is a non-argument.
Yeah. The elementary level logic here is just like, I really expect better from British intellectuals who've written best-selling books, to be honest.
Yeah.
All right.
Me too.
Yeah. Next one. And I'm a little bit slower to this because my producer, he had a last minute scheduling conflict.
I understand.
The wonderful Terrell Zacharias, who's, by the way, a big fan of yours. Yes. He loves your work. All right.
The shapeshifter thing, and I'm not talking about the language in which the far right talks about the Jews. The shapeshifter thing, which I was also trying to fight in that conversation, is I never said I was a historian.
Yeah, I just spent 5 hours on television this week declaiming about the topic.
I merely, when people introduce me as a historian, I don't demur from the introduction. And if somebody introduces me as the world's greatest living historian, I don't.
Now you're talking about Daryl Cooper. Yeah.
But if you were to have, at the beginning of this podcast, introduced me as the world's leading engineer of suspension bridges, Douglas Murray, I think I might have had no. But if I started to speak as if I was that, at some point you are pretending to be that. If you keep being introduced to historian, but then you have the move of saying, I never said I was a historian. If you keep saying, I'm a comedian, but I'm not, I'm a commentator on a particularly febrile foreign conflict, and then you say, but you don't know about this, and you go, well, I'm just a comedian. And you play these endless games of assertion of knowledge, followed by, if you get caught, okay, I don't know about this. This is a very, very annoying rhetorical trick that some of us have observed, because it means you can never be pinned down.
Yeah.
I don't know when you've ever articulated that, where you get something wrong, you're like, oh, I'm actually just a comedian. I think if I'm trying to steelman them, they're referring to Daryl Cooper, who, and then he's going to come up in this podcast. I want to focus on you. He does come up. But in the podcast with Joe, he brought up Daryl Cooper. And then I think you said, well, Daryl doesn't claim to be a historian. I think that's, if I'm trying to be bending over backwards and being charitable to him, he's probably annoyed that and you said Daryl's not a historian yet, Tucker Carlson or whatever introduces him as the world's greatest historian.
Yeah, I mean, Tucker introduced him as something like the greatest, current pop historian or something like that. Again, kind of like as you said before, it's just for two people, for Douglas Murray and Sam Harris, who are known, their whole claim is that they're the smart guys, they're the high IQ people who are really going to discuss things in a sophisticated way. This is so painfully ridiculous. It's like painfully stupid.
Yeah, you should clarify that you never do this, right? Just
I've never. He cannot point to one example ever where I've claimed to be an expert, and then when someone called me on something, I went, "Hey, I'm just a comedian." That didn't happen in our 3-hour-long debate. It hasn't happened in any of the multiple debates that I've done on this subject or on many other subjects. It's never happened on one panel on all of the news shows that I've done over the last 15 years. It's just never. It's not something I do. Now, to say that you're responsible for what a host introduces you as, and then to use this completely ridiculous false analogy of if you were to open this show by saying I'm the greatest astrophysicist in the world, then I'd probably be like, oh, hey, dude, I'm not an astrophysicist. Like, okay, that's true. But if you were to open this show and say, Dave's the greatest comedian in the world, and then I just don't say anything, and I just go, well, thank you very much. That's very kind of you. And then we go. And then on some other show, someone goes, Dave claimed to be the greatest comedian in the world. And I was like, no, I don't think I'm the greatest. Like, I've never made that claim. It's totally like, there's just no, it's not. I guarantee you that Douglas Murray, because it's so funny because all these guys do in their circle, they're all so ass kissy with each other. I guarantee you Douglas Murray has been introduced on interviews and at banquets and at cocktail parties of being like this amazing thinker, the most eminent guy on this. And you're saying now that if he doesn't correct them, essentially he's making that claim about himself. This is stupid. I don't know what we're talking about here. Tucker Carlson, if you want to get into what the definition of a historian is, like, I would certainly argue like that Daryl is a historian, but he doesn't. He goes, I'm just a history nerd. I just read a ton about this stuff. But like, okay, if you say the standard for being considered a historian is the fact that you yourself actually were like the first person to write about primary sources, or that you went through, and it's like, okay, fine, but that's going to disqualify about 80% of people who call themselves historians right now, who no one else seems to have a problem with using that title. If you're going to say it's just degrees from a university, I think there's some flaws in that metric also. So, again, it's just, like I said at the beginning of the show, it'll just keep coming up. The through line through all of this is just not taking on anyone's argument. It's all just it's smearing people without like refuting anything.
Yeah, and to be clear, and I think I know how you're going to answer this, but what do you claim about yourself? Like, yes, you are a comedian, but I assume you would also consider yourself a political commentator who's read a lot of things, who's informed about certain subjects, right? That is one of the hats you wear.
Yeah, I'm a comedian. I'm a commentator. I'm a podcaster. I mean, call it whatever you want to. Like, yeah, I'm a self-taught guy. That's true. I'm a college dropout. I'm not claiming to have any academic degree or any formal expertise, but I think that I'm very well informed. I know what I'm talking about. I don't talk about things and pretend I know what I'm talking about when I don't. And none of these guys seem to be able to argue against what I'm saying. Like, that's essentially like with all this stuff, right? Like, I never claimed throughout COVID to be an epidemiologist. I was just claiming that Fauci's full of shit, and I think I'm more than qualified to prosecute that case. And so that's what it's about. But again, our system, and I don't even mean like the new media, like the old media, Douglas Murray's media, the legacy corporate media is permeated by commentators. They're all over the place. So if you got some issue where you're going to say that only experts can ever talk about this stuff or whatever, it's like, fine. But again, it's not like Douglas is going out and debating a bunch of other experts on this topic. And so again, this whole thing falls apart.
Yeah. Part of the problem here is like semantics, but it's even deeper than semantics, because it's about how this new information age, now further increased by ChatGPT and AI and all these tools too, people have rapid access to information, and they can read the world's greatest books, literature, podcasts, videos, documentaries. And so I'm an example similar to you, right? I didn't go to journalism school. I guess you could say I dropped out of college. Before I went to college, right after high school, I started writing some articles in the New York Post, did really well. And people like Douglas were very kind and generous in praising some of that work and tweeting it and sharing it. And as I mentioned earlier, Douglas was very nice and generous and facilitating a connection when my work, it was hard to publish my work on COVID, particularly vaccine side effects. And I have no degrees. I have no degrees in epidemiology or vaccinology or virology to make me an expert in studying vaccine side effects. Yet I was writing about it, and Douglas very generously, very kindly helped out in a certain way privately to help me publish some of that work more and more, or at least figure out how to increase my profile and make a name for myself. And so like all these guys, right? It's like, are we really experts in like the thing that we're talking about? I mean, being a journalist, being a commentator, being a podcaster, it's intrinsically a pretty amorphous fluid thing. And then one important point, which I've tweeted about, is crucial to make here, is that all these guys, right? Douglas, Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson, these people with PhDs or degrees in something, regularly talk about things that they don't have PhDs in or degrees in, right? Like for Sam Harris, his big thing was talking about Islam and, you know, giving his analysis of Islam and why there are certain violent aspects of it that are incompatible with the West. He has a degree in neuroscience. He also has a meditation app. He also talks about, he did a fantastic podcast in 2020 about Black Lives Matter and going step by step, examining some of the statistics around police shootings. It was a masterful podcast. I think it's called "Can We Pull Back from the Brink?" It was amazing to listen to it at the time. One of the greatest pieces of just analysis on Black Lives Matter, police shooting, criminal justice system. Right? You could come along and say, "Well, Sam, you're not a PhD sociologist at Columbia who studies systemic racism and has 25 papers published in top sociology journals about why there's systemic racism." Yet he did a wonderful 3-hour podcast breaking down that. Or same with Islam. Right. And, like Jordan Peterson's a great example, too. Psychology professor. Yeah. And the big thing he's known for these days in the past couple of years is analyzing the Bible from a psychologist perspective, which I find fascinating. And I actually like that more than getting the dogmatic literalist, you know, interpretation of the Bible. I find that amazing. But that's not, he doesn't have any theology degree in biblical exegesis. And yet he's, you know, using his understanding of psychology and Jungian archetypes, and he talks about like psychedelics and the Bible and like all this like interesting stuff. It's like with all these guys, and same with Douglas too, right? Douglas wrote The Madness of Crowds, great book on identity politics. But if you put him against like a PhD in sociology or someone who's studying gender studies, right, which is a degree you can get a PhD in gender studies or race relations, ethnic studies, things like that. You could get someone in theory, lots of people at Columbia and Harvard, University of Chicago or whatever, who have been studying racism and gender relations and homophobia for 30 years. And Douglas has, you know, spent a couple of years or whatever amount of time reading some of the, you know, source texts in the book where he sources some of these crazy, wacko, far left people. So he's done the work. And so he wrote a great book called The Madness of Crowds. But if you want to play this game of, well, what are your credentials when, okay, put a PhD in gender studies in front of Douglas, and does that mean that person has better arguments? No, Douglas has better arguments on that, but it's not because he has more credentials on gender studies or race studies or whatever.
And of course, we could both just imagine that if anyone ever used this argument against Sam Harris or Douglas Murray, as they easily could, you know, say, "Hey, Douglas Murray, you don't have the, you know, any training in gender studies, and therefore you can't have this comment about transgenders," or you say the same thing about Sam Harris with Black Lives Matter or something like that. You would watch them tear apart that nonsense with the exact arguments that me and you are making on this podcast. Like they would flip around and take my exact position, and they'd be 100% correct to say, screw that. You got to either take on my argument or you can't take on my argument. Like it's one of the others. And so it's sad to see them using the exact same argument. You know, when you know that if that happened to them, which easily could, they would respond with exactly what I am saying.
Yeah, and I think I might have seen segments like that, like with Sam and his criticisms of Islam, right? People, or even with the identity politics, Black Lives Matter, gender studies. I've seen stuff like far left people like, oh, this guy Douglas Murray writing a book on gender and race relations, and yet where's his PhD in gender studies? He doesn't know what he's talking. He doesn't understand all the sociological impacts of the racist patriarchy. And I think I've seen stuff particularly with like Islam of like, Sam Harris is not an Islamic theologian. What the hell is he saying? Or like, say with the Bible, that's a very common one too. Like Jordan Peterson, like he's not an expert in biblical analysis. Like, why is he talking about this stuff? And yet, like, I find Jordan Peterson's stuff on the Bible actually more interesting than what the mainstream, you know, dogmatic Christian theologians take on those things. Let's keep going to the next one.
Tom Stoppard memorably, incredibly describes it. But people like him who are doing this, I just warned him. I said, you must know, because he said something like, you know, there's this sort of fertile ground at one moment. I said, you're doing the watering of it. Mm-hmm. You're watering this. You're bringing it up. You're conspicuously engaged in the process of trying to grow an extremely poisonous tree. and it's going to get you and then all of us, by which I mean, of course, you encourage the most ugly, debunked, destructive bigotries of human history.
Mm.
And they are always ones which, once they flourish and once they grow, burn everyone.
Yeah. So, but
Yeah, this is just so ridiculous. So, okay, let me just start first. First of all, yes, there's been a rise in anti-Semitism, conspiracy thinking, blaming the Jews for everything. And yes, if you say anything, right, if I bring up in my reporting, or Jay Bhattacharya did, about the dangers of mRNA vaccines and young people and myocarditis, yes, some people will take that and be like, oh, that means all vaccines are bad. And oh, you have some really crazy people who say, oh, that's in line with our view of the genocide of vaccines and autism and all this stuff. But it's that's not how you argue, right? That's not how you talk. And there's actually one example with do you remember this back in the day? And this is why Sam Harris has been a big part of my intellectual development. When he had Charles Murray on, and then Ezra Klein attacked him for doing that podcast because he brought Charles Murray brought up the race IQ controversial thing. And then Ezra Klein's point was, you doing this podcast and having on this guy encourages racism. It encourages people to think that people of a certain skin color have lower IQ. And you're essentially, he said, you're watering this fertile ground of racism, and you're being incredibly irresponsible for having on a guy saying that. And it's like, again, yes, when you say anything, there's going to be certain people that read into that and take it to an extreme, but that's not a point against the actual arguments of the matter. And lastly, with Douglas in particular, his book, Strange Death of Europe, his criticisms of Islam, and very cogently, very eloquently articulated about clashes within societies that don't value women's rights, gay rights, free speech, letting mass numbers of those people in could create a clear clash. And we have examples like Sweden and France, where there's these no-go zones, people coming from Middle Eastern and African countries who clearly don't respect women's rights. Like, all that is 100% true. And yet for sure, you have people who will read and watch Douglas Murray talk about that, who then end up saying Muslims are inferior people, they have low IQ, they're monsters, all Muslims are like ISIS. There's for sure been that. And he said, I think in your podcast, that he's called that out, and he's been very careful in calling that out. I haven't seen him do that. I'm taking his word. I'm sure he said that at some point. I'm sure. But again, if you want to use that as an argument, then Douglas Murray should never talk about the dangers of mass migration from Muslim majority countries, because that will inevitably increase Islamophobia. But you should still talk about it, even if it encourages some crazy people to take it to an extreme.
Yeah, it's funny that you brought up that example, because that was somewhere in the back of my mind. I've not thought about that in years, but that's right. And when Sam Harris, I remember he had like a response podcast, like a solo podcast about the controversy of having Murray on a show, not Douglas Murray, Charles Murray on a show.
Yeah.
And one of the points that he made was that how when they were mapping out the human genome, they found out that, or at least this is the belief, that white Europeans share some DNA in common with Neanderthals, but that Black people don't. And he was like, now imagine those results had been the opposite. Imagine it had been that we found that Black people shared DNA with Neanderthals. Now you could see where that would be used by a lot of racists. But if we found that, we still have to say that we found that. Like, science can't be in the business of not telling the truth just because it may lead to other. So again, with both of these guys and all of these pathetic like arguments, all you got to do is listen to them two yesterday to disprove what them two today are saying. Again, this and I did, of course, I hit back and made that exact point in the debate, and the answer was like totally pathetic, because if Douglas Murray is going to say, well, I am very careful to make sure I don't encourage that, well, much like you, I've never actually heard that from Douglas Murray. I've never heard in any of his comments about how. Now, again, I'm not saying he's never done that.
Yeah, I'm sure he's done it.
I'm sure he has.
Yeah, he doesn't say every time he talks about it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so have I. I've gone out of my way to say, like, I don't like the Jew hating stuff. I don't think that's the right answer. I don't like racialism. I don't like any of that stuff. But I'm sorry, it's a little bit weird. It's very, I'll just say that of all of the woke claims of victimhood, which I consider this to be in that category, but of all the woke claims of victimhood, I gotta say, the Jewish one just is the weakest. It's like by far the weakest of any of them. I mean, look, there's no question, as you said, there's been a rise in Jew hatred over the last 18, 19 months. There's no question
absolutely.
about that. But there's also been a rise and a continuation of the most dehumanizing bigotry toward the Palestinians. I mean, and to a level that just simply does not exist with the Jew hatred. I mean, I've had in multiple debates that I've done on the Israel-Palestine topic, I've had my opponents argue to me that Palestinians do not have rights, including the women and children. I've had other people argue to me that there's no such thing as innocent Palestinians. And this is as they are getting slaughtered. Now, I'm sorry, like maybe that does exist. I have not heard anyone making that argument against Jews, certainly not anyone who's like in a respectable debate or anything like that. And so, yeah, like dehumanizing bigotry against any entire group of people is bad. And telling inconvenient truths can always lead toward that. And so there's an interesting conversation there about like the responsibility that all of us have about guarding against that. Obviously, the conclusion is not stop telling the truth, if that might lead to bigotry. But again, it's just not a point against me in the debate. Douglas Murray and Sam Harris are every bit as guilty of this, if not more guilty of this than I am. And again, it's like, you know, there is one of the reasons why the Jewish claim of victimhood, and I say this as a Jewish person, but one of the reasons why the Jewish claim of victimhood is the weakest is that Jews are thriving. Like Jews aren't a marginalized group that is, you know, like whatever the comment about Black people in America is, there certainly are real issues in the Black community. Now, you could argue what's causing that, and that's a topic for a very long conversation and probably much more than that. And there's been many books written on the subject, but that's just not the case with Jews. And the truth is that over, you know, if you're talking about anti-Muslim bigotry, well, what have you been watering, Douglas Murray and Sam Harris? Since I was 18, so I'm 42 now, but so for in basically your lifetime, okay, since you were born, there's been how many millions of innocent Muslims killed in US-led wars? Probably between 3 to 4 million, something like that, between Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Somalia, Yemen, the drone bomb campaign in Pakistan. Now, if you want to add into that the destruction of Gaza, which of course is totally funded and armed by the US. I mean, so you want to talk about like, look, anti-Muslim bigotry, you could point to like a lot more disastrous results than you can with that. But again, I'll say all of it's wrong. Nobody's supporting dehumanizing entire groups of people. But again, by their own logic, they're more guilty of it than I am.
Yeah, it's with all these things. I think this is an interesting pattern I'm spotting where they mention a general problem, but it doesn't apply to you. Just like with all the other stuff, you haven't been there. You're not an expert. You're just a comedian. You don't want Dave Smith operating on you in brain surgery, or in this case, the rise in anti-Semitism. It's like, yes, like all those are real. Conspiracy things are a real problem. Yes, you should go to places and discover them and whatever. And yes, anti-Semitism is a real problem. But like, how does that apply to Dave? Like, it's like if he had said anti-Semitism is a real problem, look what you're watering. Look what you said in this thing. Look this claim that I'm bringing up in this podcast, where you said that Israel is conspiring with the WEF and doing this, and it's part of some broad program to suppress other people who are not Jewish. And like, look what it's like that didn't happen. He didn't point to anything that you said that was anti-Semitic. You just brought up anti-Semitism. It's like it's such a stupid woke tactic. Where it's like you can do the same shit about them, right? Talk to Douglas Murray about his criticisms of Islam and be like, well, do you know the rise in anti-Islamic bigotry? Do you know this like one kid in this one high school got bullied for being Muslim? Look at what you're watering with the strange death of Europe. What are you doing, man? It's like you could play that game and then suddenly like people might be sensitive to that and be like, oh my God, Douglas might be watering Islamophobia. But that's not a real argument against his incredible book, The Strange Death of Europe.
Right. And like I said on the last clip there, and if someone made that argument to Douglas Murray, he would respond exactly as I'm responding right now and tear it apart. It's just, this is what's so sad about it. It's like the hypocrisy is just so overwhelming. And again, like this is what, if you go watch the Rogan episode, as many have, this is what he did throughout the whole debate. Like it'd be like at one point, like we'd be debating and I'd argue something specific and I'd go like, I'd say, the National Endowment for Democracy and the USAID poured $100 million into the Maidan Revolution. So you can't just say this was some organic revolution when the US poured $100 million into it. And his response would be, sometimes libertarians like to act as if everything done in the world was done by America. And we're the only actors in here. And you're like, yeah, that sure would be stupid if that's what I had said. But what I said was that the NED and the USAID poured $100 million into the Maidan Revolution. Could we take on that? And then the answer, no. He has no response to that. So it's always like, again, the through line through all of this, it's a very convenient way to never have to take on a single argument because they can't.
Yeah. Okay, we got 4 more clips. One of them is, again, similar to this, and then we have 3 clips after that where it's actually we're getting into some of the arguments, which is more interesting.
Crucial point is that you were not saying that Dave Smith couldn't possibly be right because he's a non-expert.
No.
You're saying that he's a non-expert and it shows because he's making obvious errors. And so it is with Daryl Cooper, and so it is with many of these people who are getting platformed, right? And so it's not the consequence of being a non-expert in this case is that these guys are trafficking in recognizable distortions of fact and coming to the wrong moral conclusions as a result. And then a very easy way to summarize that problem is, listen, you're talking to people who are non-experts. Why not talk to the experts? That's not to deny the fact that people are entitled to their own opinions, that sometimes someone can be self-taught and actually make a valid contribution to knowledge.
Absolutely.
And to flip it around, it's also the case that arguments from authority are illegitimate, and nothing is true simply because a consensus of Nobel laureates says it is. It's just that a consensus of Nobel laureates is often a very good guide to the best state of the evidence, right? I mean, that's shorthand for finding the best evidence and the best arguments.
Sure. By the way, I just would say one other thing, which is that
he's going to go into a different thing now. I Sam Harris is such a, oftentimes a very brilliant speaker, but he's catching all the caveats and making sure he hits all the boxes. And so it sounds really brilliant, and he's making some good points in there about expertise mattering. But again, it's how does that apply to any of what you're saying? He's like, oh yeah, we're not saying Dave shouldn't have free speech and people shouldn't say their opinion. They should, but it shows. But it's again, name one thing where it shows where Dave said that. And again, to my earlier point, Sam's expertise starts and ends with neuroscience, if you want to play that game. And maybe he spent 10 years in India and studied Buddhism and Hinduism, which is fascinating, which is why I like his work and why I've talked to him before. It's okay, you want to comment about Eastern spirituality, you want to comment about, he's done psychedelics, neuroscience. That's where it starts and ends, my friend, if you want to play that game. But no, but it shouldn't end there, because your criticisms of Black Lives Matter are very cogent, identity politics, all these things. He's made a lot of sense on those topics. And just like that, you're making sense on some of these topics, yet for you, it's not like that. For you, it's, where's your degree? You haven't been to Israel. It's you could do the same thing with Sam Harris and Douglas Murray.
Right, exactly. And it's throughout the whole podcast, I mean, it's just wild. I haven't watched this, so it's interesting to just sit here as you play clip after clip, and I'm almost feeling bad that I don't want to just repeat the same thing, but every single clip, it's the same thing to say. It's guys, I got the assertion. We get it. Your assertion is that I'm wrong about stuff. Okay, you're asserting the claim that I'm wrong. That's not an argument. There's assertions and then there's arguments. Okay, we all start with assertions before we make our arguments. You know what I mean? You all start with this is wrong. Now let me build an argument for why this is wrong. But I've got the assertion. Where does the argument part come in? Okay, if you were to say, say in the debate, which we had 3 hours together, if you were to start by saying what Sam Harris just said there, you go, listen, I'm not saying you can't have an opinion because you're not an expert. I'm saying you're not an expert, and it shows because you're getting a lot of things wrong. My next response would have been, okay, what am I getting wrong? And then you could demonstrate that. But that part never comes. It's just always like
it's actually about to come. So this is half an hour. So
okay, all right.
We're gonna get into a couple things, but on that point, yeah, they're spending a lot of time. They're saying all these. You're not an expert. You're a comedian. You've never been there. There's conspiracy thinking out there. Anti-Semitism's out there. It's like all these are non-arguments for you. They are arguments for something. Again, conspiracy thinking is a real problem. Anti-Semitism is a real problem. All these things, but that doesn't really apply to you. And to Sam's point, he's like, we're not saying Dave shouldn't have an opinion. We're not saying. And there's some other clips we're not going to play because it'll take too much time. But he's like, yeah, sometimes Galileo gets stuff right. Sometimes you have the 1 out of 100 guy who says something right, who doesn't have a PhD in epidemiology or whatever. But yes, you should have free speech and say what you want. But they're saying Dave's. We're not saying everyone should be an expert and only talk. We're saying Dave's non-expertise shows. That's what we're saying. We're saying it's clear he's a clown. That's
right.
That's
okay, but like again, let me just a mild point of pushback, because it's all of this. It's such it just seems very obvious to me that like they're working back from their conclusion, and even like it does seem like there's a little bit of insecurity in Sam Harris as he makes this argument. Like he's got to throw out the caveats because he already sees like how you could slap down this argument that he's making. So he's like, let me be clear, I'm not. But look, the framing of this is such bullshit, because the comparison to say like Galileo, it's like, dude, I'm not claiming that I'm a completely self-taught guy who's like rethought science and philosophy and is going to make some contribution that's going to like change the course of human development. Another way to look at this would be like, hey, look, there were a lot of people who weren't military experts, just regular people who would have gone, I really don't think we should invade Iraq. This would probably be like a really bad idea to do that. And they were right. It doesn't have to be like some humanity changing discovery. It could just be someone being like, hey, I think we should abolish slavery. Hey, I don't think we should fight this stupid war. Hey, I think taxes are too high and the economy would grow quicker if we lowered them. There's like regular points that regular people can make and be correct about. It doesn't have to just be the one self-taught genius who's reinventing the wheel. Like it's just kind of like a false framing of all of this.
Yeah, that's a good point. And one other thing, before we get into the arguments, which is only like a couple clips here.
Let's get to it. All right.
Yeah. But one other thing too about Douglas, which in line with what I was saying about Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris and all these things, is that Douglas, he has a degree in English, a bachelor's degree, I believe, not a PhD, bachelor's degree in English. And in 2005, he wrote this book, Neoconservatism, Why We Need It. And so he doesn't have a degree in political science, international affairs, global affairs, foreign policy. Those are all degrees you can get, by the way. I was once considering getting those degrees, or international studies. It's like, well, you go from English degree to why we need neoconservatism a few years later.
It's okay. But see, the thing is, it's okay when you're advocating. Well, it's okay when you're advocating for a war. You don't have to be an expert to advocate for a war. You just have to be an expert to advocate against one. That seems to be the standard.
Yeah. It's just ridiculous. Okay, so we actually have a couple of arguments.
Let's do it.
And have been convinced for more than 20 years as the true one, is that jihadism is an independent variable. And you can find this death cult behavior in people who have been immiserated by occupations and been treated badly. And you can find it in people who have not been immiserated. Yeah. And so it's the ideas that give you the death cult. And conversely, you can find people who have been treated far worse than the Palestinians, and they never manufacture an endless supply of suicide bombers.
Yeah.
So it's the ideas, it's the culture, the most glaring scotoma in Dave Smith's non-expertise is a complete failure to appreciate the reality of jihadism and just what Israel is actually dealing with in Hamas.
I believe that.
Okay, so here's where we're getting into some of the substantive points, as long as that took to get there. And I'll just say, and I think this is an important point to make. So I've in the past been fairly convinced and persuaded by people like Sam Harris and Douglas Murray growing up in high school, and after listening to their criticisms of radical Islam and the role of jihadism in some of these conflicts. Again, as I said earlier, I don't consider myself well read on foreign policy yet. I'm reading, I'm learning. I mean, I'm fairly young, and I've already taken on COVID mandates, big pharma, identity politics, like a bunch of things. BLM, I wrote a lot about that. So I have not read enough to have a strong opinion on Israel Palestine or foreign policy. I learn from people like you. I also listen to people on the other side, like Ben Shapiro and Douglas Murray and Barry Weiss and these people. So here's where my expertise is or my understanding of this issue is very much young, and I'm still learning about these things. And so I don't opine beyond the one thing I have written about and talked about in the past is this very real cultural clash between Western values and radical Islamic values, and the problems that we're seeing in countries like Sweden and France, where people don't share the same values about free speech and gay rights, women's rights, minority rights, and things like that. And I've been very much influenced by people like Douglas and Sam on that, and I still agree with them on that. And I think you do too. But to this point about you are not understanding the role of radical Islam in this conflict, what do you make of that?
Okay, so let me just say, first of all, I don't think we really got to a substantive argument here. I mean, I think, again, this is an assertion. It's an assertion that I don't understand the nature of jihad, or that I don't account for the reality of what Israel has to deal with. I don't think that's true. There's no question that there are real problems in the Muslim world. And a bunch of really horrible problems. And there are certainly major problems incorporating Muslim immigrants into Western societies, particularly recently. It actually has, as somebody who grew up in New York City, we were actually somewhat successful at incorporating Muslim immigrants. But of course, it was done in much smaller numbers over much longer periods of time. And so I'm not saying like it's impossible to do, but there's no question that there are attitudes about free speech and women's rights and all types of different things that are major issues. And this is why I'm not an advocate of open borders. I'm an immigration restrictionist, and I think that both American and European immigration policy for the last 20 years has been, I think, insane is an understatement. Suicidal might be more accurate. And there's no question that there are major problems within the Muslim world, in Muslim countries, and jihadism is one of the major ones. Again, I don't think I've ever denied this. And in fact, one of my major criticisms of Western foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy, and Israeli foreign policy has been the constant strategy of propping up jihadist groups in order to achieve certain outcomes. And of course, the most obvious one here would be Netanyahu in his efforts to fund and prop up Hamas in the decade leading up to October 7th. But don't forget about the U.S. propping up the Bin Laden Mujahideen and the arming and funding of Al Qaeda and ISIS in Libya and in Syria. So it's like, look, it is true that there are major problems with jihad, and there are major problems all throughout the Muslim world. I mean, these horrible practices of female child genital mutilation in Kurdistan, and there's all types of awful problems with freedom of religion in Pakistan and in Saudi Arabia. There's again, Saudi Arabia, our closest ally in the region, the country we've been propping up for 50 years, is the biggest exporter of Wahhabism in the world. And so, yes, these are major problems. U.S. foreign policy and Israeli foreign policy have contributed to these problems. That's not to take away any of the agency or responsibility on those individuals involved. But again, as I find to be the case with so many of these things, give me the objective standard by which I'm to denounce radical Islam, and then but give me the objective standard. Because if you want to talk about the damage that's been done in the Middle East, okay, you can point to the jihadists. There's a lot of Islamists who have terrorized that region, but there's also America's war in Iraq America's war in Afghanistan, America's war in Pakistan, America's war in Yemen, America's war in Libya, America's war in Syria, America's war in Somalia, and they just killed millions of people, and including, led to the death of thousands of U.S. servicemen and tens of thousands, if you count the ones who blow their brains out in the aftermath of all of it. So again, like, nothing is taking on anything that I actually said here. I'm not like, there might be some goofy leftist out there who pretends that like there are none of these problems with Islam, but that's
you're
certainly
Islamophobic
not
if
me.
you bring up these issues, right? You get a lot of that.
But it just certainly doesn't apply to me. And I think it's fine to have an honest conversation about these things. But then again, I do think you're in a place where you also have to have an honest conversation about how corrupt and evil our government has been, and the amount of innocent people that they've killed and terrorized. And so it's I think it's just much more complicated than Sam Harris makes it seem. And I would just add, a few points where Sam's point has always been for years that you can draw a straight line from the Quran to these acts of violent terrorism, where you can't do that from Judaism, or you can't do that from Christianity. But again, it's just not true. It's simply not true. I mean, there is no shortage of Israelis. Go watch that documentary they did on the settlers in the West Bank. These are fundamentalist religious Jews who argue that God has given them this land and they are the chosen people, and therefore these other people are less than human and have no rights whatsoever. And there are like, again, when you do this, you could find little points of evidence that indicate there is some truth to what Sam Harris is saying. I'm not saying that there's no truth to what he's saying.
Obviously, the rise of Islamic terrorism in the West, right? The Charlie Hebdo attacks, the Manchester Ariana Grande bombing, all kinds of attacks.
And we should be much stronger in standing up to that stuff and having a backbone and simply not accepting that. But at the same time, there's other points of evidence that really very strongly contradict Sam Harris's worldview. So, for example,
I think he would concede what you're saying about the fundamentalism that you're pointing to within Judaism. But when it comes to, say, violence and terrorism, he would say no religion, and it seems to be true, no other religion seems to have this. I mean, we haven't seen a lot of terror attacks in the last few years in the West, but we saw a lot in Europe and the U.S. and Canada.
So what's the definition of terrorism?
Violent attacks by foreign political enemies.
Yeah, I mean, so again, if you want to say that the America nuking Hiroshima and Nagasaki is not terrorism, shock and awe is not terrorism, our sanctions regimes are not terrorism, Israel's 60-year-long occupation is not terrorism, like, fine, but you're back to the Noam Chomsky definition of terrorism, which essentially is it's terrorism when they do it, and it's counterterrorism when we do it. The truth is that so many of the U.S. policies and the Israeli policies have specifically been designed to terrorize the civilian population into getting the outcome that we want. They will openly say this about sanctions. This is the official justification of the sanctions against Venezuela or Cuba or Iran or North Korea, is that we want to get the people to turn on their own government. In other words, we want to impoverish the people so much that they rise up against their regimes. Let me just make again, I'm open to an objective definition of this by which my government and the Israeli government is also not guilty. I just haven't heard one. And, there was after World War I, there was this commission called the King Crane Commission that went to, they done this huge fact-finding mission through the Middle East. And they were basically trying to figure out what to do with the Ottoman territories now that the Ottoman Empire had collapsed. And they went to Syria and surveyed tens of thousands of people, from people in the government and diplomats down to just like regular people. And they asked them who they wanted to rule over them in a League of Nations mandate. And they overwhelmingly voted for the United States of America because they had nothing but a positive view of America. This is in Syria at the end of World War I. Now, they hated the British and the French, but they loved America. Now, why do you think that might be? Now, maybe it's because the British and the French had been dominating and oppressing them, and America had not. Now, cut forward, and there's tremendous hatred of America. But look, all I'm saying is that even the radical Islamists, in their own words, told you what this fight was about. Like we've inherited
the Osama
a fight.
bin Laden letter.
Yeah, and not just the Osama bin Laden letter. I mean, the letter is what went viral. His open letter to America went viral on TikTok. But there was his two declarations
and just to summarize,
of war.
in the letter, he does give some religious reasons, but he gives a lot of reasons for foreign policy. You know, and whether he's right or wrong, what he said was, you've bombed our countries, you've overthrown our leaders, you've caused all this chaos in the Islamic world, and that's what drove us to do this. And that's more recently I've been sort of trying to understand that. And Osama bin Laden didn't orchestrate an attack in Norway or Brazil or France, where gay people have rights, and women wear swimsuits in public. It's like, it's not all religious fundamentalism in some of those cases.
Well, it's people are complicated, and people are more than one thing. So it's like, yes, Osama bin Laden is a fanatic. Clearly, he's an Islamist, and that comes across in the open letter to America. It comes across in both his declarations of war on the United States of America and in his multiple interviews that he gave during the 90s. But he is also listing out very clear stated grievances. I mean, the open letter to America starts with, why do we attack you? Because you attack us. That is very clearly the central theme there. And they have a very clear list of grievances. It was the bases in their holy land in Saudi Arabia. It was that we prop up the brutal dictators. I mean, after all, these were all a bunch of Saudis and Egyptians. These were people who had grown up their entire lives under brutally repressive regimes that are sock puppets of the United States of America. It was our support for Israel, their treatment of the Palestinian people, our sanctions regimes, and our bombing campaigns in Iraq. I mean, there was a list of things here. But so, again, the argument that I'm making is, I've always been making a more nuanced argument than what Sam Harris is saying here. I'm not saying that Islamists aren't real or that they're not a problem. I'm saying that we have backed them, provoked them, and inherited a fight with them that we need not inherit. So if he wants to take on any of that, fine.
You're making sense. You're talking about the role of foreign policy, which has been disastrous, in geopolitics in this. But again, to Sam's point about there being a clear line between Islamic fundamentalism and like Charlie Hebdo attacks, the Manchester attacks, I believe the Ariana Grande concert, where explicitly these people say it's because of these people's, there are cases like these where it's like, it's because of these people's values, their respect for free speech and women's rights, and their belief in martyrdom and getting whatever 72 virgins or however many it is in heaven and things like that. And that being a very clear problem that you don't really see with Christianity or Judaism or Hinduism to the extent you do with Islam.
And that's a strong argument if you're talking about the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Europe, but he's talking about what Israel has to deal with. And the truth is that Israel engaged in a strategy of propping up Hamas so that there would never be a Palestinian state. They go out of their way to undercut the moderate voices, because what the moderate voices are saying, and by the way, this is not, you can read this in their own words, all of them.
Yeah, explain. I've heard this, but explain this in case people don't know what you're talking about. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it was an open plan for years that Benjamin Netanyahu developed, and it had a lot of pushback actually within Israel, because it's a pretty radical plan even for those guys. But there's quotes where they acknowledge that this is real, all up and down, from from Benjamin Netanyahu, from Ehud Barak, from Smotrich, from dozens and dozens of admissions from the top level in the Israeli government. There's been major pieces written on this. There was a piece on October 8th written by Tal Schneider in the Times of Israel. There's pieces in the Jerusalem Post, in Haaretz, in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, all about this. But essentially, Israel's problem was with moderate Palestinian voices rising up, because the moderates used to say things like, hey, let's make a deal, let's have a two-state solution, or maybe even a one-state solution, and then they didn't ever want to give the Palestinians their own state. And so they propped up Hamas because they thought that was a way that they could turn to the international community as well as to the liberal Jews in Israel and say, look, we have no partner for peace. Literally, I could sit here and read you quotes if you want, where they explain
and how
explicitly.
Did they prop up Hamas? How did they prop up?
They essentially insisted that Qatar keep funding them. And in one example, this was the New York Times ran a whole piece on this called "Buying Quiet." In one example, just a couple weeks before October 7th, Netanyahu actually sent the head of Mossad to Qatar because the funds had dried up, to beg, in a former Israeli defense minister's own words, to beg the Qataris to continue the funding. Suitcases of cash, going directly to Hamas in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And so, again, I just don't think you don't get to pursue that policy and then say, you don't understand, we have these jihadists at our doorstep. Like, sorry, that like you have to do one or the other, but you can't prop them up and then turn around and cry about how they're right next door to you.
Okay, that makes sense. But to bend over backwards again for him, like Hamas's charter says they hate the Jews. They have genocidal aims to kill all the Jews. They're a suicidal death cult who have very backwards ideas, right? What emphasis do you put on that, on their radical ideology?
I mean, look, there's no question. Yeah, Hamas is a group of fanatics, and although they did for a while kind of moderate after their original charter, they did kind of update and walk back a lot of that stuff. But then they went right back into embracing terrorism, and there really wasn't much of a period of time where they weren't embracing terrorism. I think that, look, there's been a lot written on this. There's a lot of this stuff is books I haven't read for a long time. There's a great book called Dying to Win. I'd highly recommend if people want to like understand the nature of kind of like suicide bombings and radical Islam. But the point is that if you're trying to draw a straight line from the Quran to this kind of terrorism, one of the issues that you're going to have is that look, we're not seeing wave after wave of Muslim terrorists coming out of Indonesia. You know, where are they coming from? You're saying, oh, Israel is dealing with a terrorism problem from the areas that they occupy and have for 60 years. Okay, America is dealing with the terrorism problem of Egyptians and Saudis, two countries where we've propped up brutal dictators for many decades now. It does seem like, again, even if you want to say that Osama bin Laden's his stated grievances aren't his real grievances, he's just saying that he's motivated by his being an Islamic fundamentalist fanatic. Okay, well, it certainly is his recruiting shtick. It certainly is how he gets other people to go blow themselves up. And look, I'll just say this: the FBI since 9/11. They've done dozens and dozens of these sting operations, which are really more like entrapment. If you're familiar with like the Gretchen Whitmore thing, like this is kind of how the FBI operates. They try to find these young Muslim men, and they try to lure them into committing an act of terrorism that's never really an act of terrorism because the bombs are fake or whatever. Every now and then it fucks up and you get the World Trade Center 1 where they tried to do that and then they left and got real bombs and almost took down the towers. But every single time the FBI approaches one of these young kids, you know what they say? They never go in and go, look in the Quran. You see this verse here in the Quran? This means you're supposed to blow people up. So you got to go blow someone up. What they always do is they go, how do you feel about American foreign policy? Look at all the little baby girls that America's military's blown up over there. Doesn't that make you angry? Doesn't that make you angry?
Really?
Now,
I didn't know that.
Look at all this. Because look, man.
We know this. This is the strategy they use?
Oh, yeah, constantly. Yeah. I'll send you links on all this stuff. Oh, yeah. This is the strategy they always use. Because they know this is how you actually get people to blow themselves up in an effort to go kill other people. Now, again, I'm not saying that like there's never been the case of a Muslim just going and killing someone because they're against free speech and they made fun of the Prophet Muhammad or something like that. Like that is a problem. I'm not denying
there are
that.
lots of cases like that.
Yes, I'm not denying that. But in terms of the major foreign policy conflicts, look, who have we been at war with? Al-Qaeda and ISIS, two groups that the U.S. funded and armed. In the case of Al-Qaeda, when they were the Mujahideen, trained them specifically on how to lure a superpower into an unwinnable war in Afghanistan. Okay, so like there is a major blowback component to all of this. And that's always been my argument, and not that radical Islam is not a real thing. Right.
But then again, Sam brings up the point about what about the well-off engineer in the UK, living in LA, who goes to Afghanistan, joins Al-Qaeda, joins ISIS, because he's fully convinced that he'll gain martyrdom if he does a suicide bombing. What about those cases where geopolitics isn't seemingly involved?
I don't know, man. I'd have to go look at those specific cases, but in almost all the ones I know about, Muhammad Atta, like, it's like, no, what actually radicalized them was seeing kids getting slaughtered. And then, yes, it's true, they were Muslims, and then they were grabbing a hold of their faith too, and they were using that, and that was part of what motivated them as people. But the major thing that always gets people ready to go, like, give up their own life to maybe kill some others is not just the 72 virgins. Again, we're not seeing waves of terrorism coming out of Indonesia, which I think is the biggest Muslim population in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And it's again, there's lots of people who have written books about this stuff, but
Yeah,
you could, again, like, I think Sam Harris here, he's always had a tremendous bias because he came into this as the new atheist guy. And so he always wants to say the religious fundamentalists are the ones to blame, and we're secular societies over here, so we've got to be superior to them. But, we got people, his old thing on the Bill Maher show where he was like, the Islamists wake up every day thinking about how they can kill more people in the West. And it's like, we got a lot of people over here who wake up every day thinking about how they can drop more bombs on people in the Middle East. And we may call them neoconservatives, or we may call them, neoliberal war hawks, but we got a major problem with that too.
right.
So,
But can we not draw? Yeah, can we not make some can we not understand some nuance though between those cases? Is probably what he would say, like someone wanting to go barbarically butcher people, kids in a school, versus, oh, we need to stop Iran from doing this and that, or we need to, stop this country from having a dictatorial leader. So now we're going to bomb kids. Like those two things, both are bad. But would you not agree there's a difference?
Yeah, no, okay, so there is a difference, but I think, like, what you're guilty of a little bit there at the end is really downplaying what the true thing is. Nobody's going to bomb Iran so that they don't get a nuclear weapon. Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon, and everybody knows that. And our own national intelligence report from just earlier this year reaffirmed that there was no plan for Iran to get a nuclear.
But Iran has said they want to wipe out Israel. That's the other thing that people say.
Yeah, Israel's talked about wiping out Iran constantly. They're talking about it right now. They're literally, every Israel advocate right now is talking about the Iranian regime being wiped out. Yeah, so John McCain ran for president and said, what was that old Beach Boys song? Bomb, 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 bomb Iran. Yes, everyone has bluster and talks a big game. The point is that America has never once fought a war because we just didn't want a dictator to rise up here. We prop up dictators all over the country and overthrow democratically elected governments with the drop of a coin. You know what I mean? Like, there's like, that's not the motivation here. And yes, it is true that it is different. It is different for, say, like Hamas to break into Israel and just want to kill anything that moves than, like, it's a lot more comfortable for an advanced Westerner to talk about a surgical strike or something like that. But in reality, those surgical strikes actually aren't that surgical. And we accept quite often that, like, yeah, we're going to drop a drone bomb on a wedding. We suspect that there's one guy there who we think has done some bad things, so we'll bomb that wedding. It might be easy for us to convince ourselves that that's not terrorism. That's a whole different thing. That's not nearly as barbaric. But to the people on the receiving end of that, like, if that was your son or daughter or nephew or niece, you may not feel like that's such a good justification. You might feel like, as Osama bin Laden and all of the other Islamists always say, you might feel like, oh, our babies just don't have value, but yours do. And so, again, I'm not saying that there's no difference between the two. One is certainly much more primitive and barbaric, and the other one is much more sophisticated and advanced. And I'd rather be next door neighbors with, like, a drone operator than a member of Hamas or something like that. But the point is that these are both policies that accept that innocent women and children are going to be killed, and that they feed into each other. Like, the more you do one, the more they want to respond to you, the more that justifies you responding to them, and it keeps making the problem worse and worse. And look, this is just borne out by the evidence. There was during 9/11, or after, at the time 9/11, Osama bin Laden had a few hundred men. That was the extent of Al Qaeda. And at the height of the war on terrorism, there were tens of thousands of members of ISIS and Al Qaeda. Did nothing but grow them larger and stronger. And so, this is, I don't think it's an either or. There's a symbiotic relationship between the two.
Yeah, by the way, I'm trying to steel man Sam Harris here, as you can tell.
No, I appreciate it.
I'm trying, yeah. And on that point, I'm sure I know what you're going to say, but you would be open to debating someone or talking to someone like Sam Harris, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You've said
I've said so many times. Absolutely. Yeah.
So I'd love to see that, or if Sam wants to bring his foreign policy expert, would you do that too?
Sure.
Yeah. And I'd love to see that discussion. And I will say, Sam, he says in the Douglas podcast, we have 2 clips left, but he talks about how he's bending over backwards to be charitable to you, and he does try to steel man you a bit in the podcast for sure. I will say in a previous podcast, he said Dave Smith is a pure misinformation artist, and that was not only not charitable. I think that's totally wrong, and I feel like you should correct the record on that, and he should show what is this pure misinformation. I mean, this is the one example that he gave that you're not understanding jihadism, and just last follow up on that is like, do you put any emphasis on Hamas being the suicidal death cult? That Sam puts a lot of weight on that, but like roughly speaking, do you put any like 5%, 10%? Like, do you put a little bit of weight on that being a problem?
Oh no, it's a huge problem. I mean, it's not that it's not a problem. And I've also described them as a death cult, and so is Daryl Cooper. The point is that Hamas didn't arise in a vacuum, and that Israel has been brutally occupying Gaza and the West Bank since 1967. And they could spin whatever narratives about how they disengaged in 2005. It's all bullshit. They've completely controlled and dominated these people for nearly 60 years, longer than the Soviet Union occupied Eastern Europe. And in that environment, this death cult resistance group rose up. But yeah, I mean, the thing that I just have no respect for with a guy like Sam Harris, which because I didn't know that he said he had always been charitable with me, but it's like he calls me a pure misinformation artist without debunking one of my claims. And I just think that like in this world that we're in, that is such a low integrity move. Like if you're going to call someone a pure misinformation artist, then okay. But I would never like say that about someone on my show and it not be followed with, here's a clip of them spreading disinformation. Now I'm going to break down why that's completely wrong. Like, it's like, it's shocking to me that Douglas Murray and Sam Harris can talk this long about me without feeling the need to like, hey, let's address some of his specific claims. Like this last clip was the closest we've come. And even that was just, I don't think he understands jihad. But they're not really saying like, Dave said this, he got this wrong, he made this argument, here's the hole in that argument. Like, I just don't, I can't respect that. So he could say he's being charitable to me. I don't see it.
Well, yeah. His in the podcast that we're playing, he said, "I'm going to bend over backwards to try and be charitable to Dave Smith, who rarely seems to do the same for me." Is what he said. Although again, the pure
what am I supposed to be? Where do I find the charity in someone calling me a pure misinformation artist while not taking on a single one of my arguments? How are you supposed to be charitable in response to that? How am I supposed to, I don't know. Was Sam charitable to any of us through COVID? We all turned out to be right and he turned out to be dead wrong. And he showed us no charity through that entire thing. So like, I don't know. What do you kids say? Miss me with that.
Yeah. Listen, if Sam wants to put out a Substack, he's on Substack now, Substack article or a podcast where he goes through here are 10 things Dave Smith has gotten utterly wrong. I'd love to see that podcast. I'll tweet that podcast. I'll send it to you. We should have a conversation about that podcast. But until that happens, calling you a pure misinformation artist is just really unfair. And I would not say the same thing about either Douglas or Sam. I don't think they're pure misinformation artists. I agree with them on BLM, identity politics, mass immigration, et cetera, et cetera. They're not pure misinformation artists. And so I hope Sam provides some receipts and some stronger arguments about why he thinks you are that. All right, we got two more clips here. Here, Douglas is going to make an argument about you and your supposed anti-Americanism.
But it's also a strain of anti-Americanism and anti-Westernism, which is a belief that nobody in the world can do something wrong and bad unless we have somehow pushed them to it.
Yes, this is Noam Chomsky's gift to our politics.
Yes. It used to be on the left, and now it's on the right as well.
Yeah.
This is a profound and deep anti-Americanism, which I cannot sign up for. I will not. Profound anti-Westernism. Sees the world. Actually, funnily enough, Edward Said, to the extent that his theory on Orientalism holds at all, might have found this trend interesting, of Westerners now looking at the rest of the world and saying they can't do anything unless we make them.
Right.
Totally without any
Rob's
moral
agency of all the people you would otherwise
no
give
moral agency. And if there is an explanation for why somebody goes and blows themselves up and everyone that they can kill on a bus in Jerusalem, it's because of something to do with British mandate policy 80 years earlier. I completely reject this, and I reject it for many reasons. But one is that riding shotgun with the claim that only the West, only America can lead anyone to do bad things is what you rightly identify, Sam, as the utter inability to recognize that some people seek utterly different things than we do.
All right, your response?
I mean, look, this is just it's just batting down a straw man. I mean, it's like they don't ever, they kind of loosely claim that I'm guilty of this, but they can't point to anything I've ever said and then say this is an example of him being guilty of this. Nobody's making the claim that nobody else has agency and that only America can do wrong in the world. But at the same time, if we're just recognizing reality, America is the most powerful government in the history of the world. We are the world empire. And so we've been in charge of making a lot of very important decisions, particularly over the last 30 to 40 years, but really, from way before that. And so, it's such a cop-out to say that nobody else has agency. This is like, I don't remember if he said this during the debate, but I've gotten this a lot when I'd point out, like I said earlier in the show, that the U.S. poured $100 million into a street protest that in Ukraine that ultimately ended up overthrowing a democratically elected president, and that this was something that was seen as a big provocation to Vladimir Putin. Now, that doesn't deny any of the agency of the people on the ground. That doesn't mean that anybody there who was protesting couldn't have really had a beef with the Yanukovych government. But it's also worth pointing out that we poured $100 million into that. Like, that may have tipped the scales a little bit. And so it's not suggesting that nobody else in the world has ever done anything wrong, or suggesting that there aren't people who have very fundamentally different goals than we have. The point is that America has, particularly in the post 9/11 era, has embarked on a suicidal foreign policy that has been absolutely disastrous for our own country and for the regions where the theaters of war have taken place. It's not an anti-American position to say that. It's a pro-American position. I view this foreign policy as degrading my country that I care about very much. And, the idea that there's like this strand of anti-Americanism, I mean, that certainly is true. Certainly it permeates the left, like a strong anti-American bias. But again, that just doesn't apply to me. Just doesn't apply to me at all. I think America is the greatest country in the world. I think there's a million great things about America. I think that a lot of times these guys fall into the old Frederick Bastiat false dichotomy of being unable to separate society from the state. And so there's some idea here that, like, what if I'm critical of Joe Biden, does that mean I hate America? Like, what do you mean by that? Do I hate like the people and the mountains and the culture no, I just hate this one corrupt senile guy who's in DC exercising power over the rest of us. And that's true for the Democrats and Republicans. And I think that they deserve the contempt that I have for them. So I don't know. I mean, I find this all to be a giant straw man. Nobody's
Yeah.
denying that anybody else has agency, but there is responsibility from our government. Listen, like Washington, D.C. is the most goddamn corrupt place in the world. Who, after all these years, could deny that at this point? And so I don't know. I think it's a cop
Yeah.
out from dealing with the actual arguments being presented and a straw man.
Yeah, yeah. And as I have said before, again, I'm not a foreign policy expert. I'm still making my mind on these things. I've never publicly talked about foreign policy. I've never said anything pro-Israel or anti-Israel. But as we're talking, and I listen to all the Ben Shapiro's, Dave Rubin's. I've been on their podcast many times talking about things we agree on that you agree on as well. But one thing that I'm just seeing, generally speaking, as I'm learning and hearing you talk, is a potential blind spot with people like Sam Harris and Douglas Murray. And I don't hear them talk a lot about some of these disastrous foreign policy decisions that you talk about. And if you're wrong, I would love to see them articulate why you're wrong on that. I don't see that happening either.
Well,
I'd love to
a
see them
big part of it's
grapple
because
more with these
yeah,
things.
well, they advocated for them, and so that's a big part of the reason why they don't want to talk about that, because they don't want to look at their own track record. But I'll tell you, man, this is Douglas's problem, really, in this new marketplace, in this new landscape. Track record is a lot more important than any of his appeals to expertise or being there or whatever. It's like, what's your track record, though, dude? That's how I've blown up and gotten the platform I have. So I just have a good track record on this stuff. I've been right about so many of the most important things. I was good on Russiagate being bullshit from the very beginning. I was good on COVID from the very beginning. I was good on Ukraine from the very beginning. I was good. Like, it's just, these guys supported the warfare machine. They supported all of these wars, and they've got no real counter to it. When I said to when I said to Douglas in the debate that we've been at war for 25 years and it's killed millions of people, including thousands of our own, bravest young men, that it's cost us $8 trillion and done nothing but destabilize the region and blah, 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 and degraded our country. All he could do was quibble with the fact that I said we're at war and go, well, you say we're at war, but we're not at war. Like, he's got no real substantive response to any of that. And so, yeah, I don't know if it's a blind spot. It seems like a willful blind spot to me. They always just want to come around to just blame those Muslims. It's all their fault. There's no responsibility. But, it's like, so they could say that I'm taking agency away from all of them, but it seems like to me quite the opposite. You're denying the agency of the most powerful government in the history of the world.
Before we go to the last clip, just on that point, because you've done a deep dive into this, it seems like on Douglas's track record, his old column. So you said he was in favor of the intervention in Libya. What other ones? Was he in favor of Iraq? Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Ukraine, and now Gaza. I know for sure he's been all in on America backing those wars or fighting those wars.
Yeah, and feel free to pick one example if you want, but just generally speaking, what was the kind of like what was he arguing in those columns? Generally speaking, about Iraq, Libya, what was like the tenor?
That Gaddafi was about to go genocidal. He was about to kill all his own people, even though the guy had been in power for many decades and never done it, and there was no reason to suspect he was going to. He argued all the basic things that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, that we'd be greeted as liberators, that all the standard neocon talking points from the time, all the war propaganda that turned out to be completely wrong, totally based off lies. He either fell for it or knowingly spread lies.
And for the people who were supporting and defending, say, the intervention in Libya and where Libya is right now with the reemergence of slave markets, economic destabilization, all these things, is there any argument or any point some of these people who supported this say, like, oh, at least we don't have this, or like is there any argument that they say now?
No, they just go, oh, there was a real concern that he was going to go genocidal, and we did it for humanitarian reasons. That's what Douglas Murray tried to argue. But again, I pointed out back to him, and he had no response to this, that it's like General Wesley Clark and all of the neocons kind of already admitted that this was already the plan years before. And the plan was, this is all the clean break strategy. And anybody can go read the document for themselves. The clean break memo was written by Richard Pearl and David Wormser in a letter to Benjamin Netanyahu. that this was the new strategy going forward. It was our project for a new American century, was that we were going to go around and remake the Middle East and topple all of the governments who were enemies of Israel. And that way, they could have a clean break with the two-state solution. And that way, Israel would never have to honor their promises to give the Palestinians a state, because really the thing that was the reason why they felt they had to was because they thought it was the only way they could normalize relations with the broader Arab and Muslim world. But you don't need to normalize relations if you get the U.S. to just go overthrow all of your enemies. And that's what we've been embarking on. And that's why they overthrew Gaddafi.
Right. Interesting. Last clip. This is going to be the most contentious one. I'll try to steel man the other side here. All right.
Gaza with 1,200 civilians in Israel murdered and 250 taken hostage. And the two stated war aims of the Israeli government, the return of all the hostages and the destruction or capture of all of Hamas's leadership and fighting brigades. Whether it's in the case of Israel trying to carry out this operation of rescue and so on in Gaza, or whether it would be how America would get back 10,000 hostages in an equally built up, intensely booby-trapped terrain. If anyone watching has a battle plan for how to do that, send it to me, and I will send it to everybody I know in Israel, because I'm sure that if there is a military genius watching and listening who knows how you would carry out that operation with no civilian casualties on the side of the Gazans and minimal to no casualties on the side of the IDF, I can assure anyone watching, I and many others would be all ears. But I hear no such thing. I hear no such thing. The best I've had, I think it came up in that Rogan debate, the best I've heard is the hostages that have been released by getting around a table and negotiating. Horse shit, said by people who don't know what they're talking about. The only reason Hamas has released any of the hostages to date, including the dead bodies of babies, is because of the kinetic military force exercised for 18 months by the young men and women of the IDF. Only military pressure has made Hamas give any of the hostages back. They would all still be sitting in underground tunnels and in the basements of Al Jazeera, journalists and much more, if there had been no military action in Gaza. Sinwar would still be alive if the IDF had not painstakingly fought in Gaza for a year. People simply do not understand this. And when they say things like, but why don't the Israelis just get around the table with Hamas? I'm afraid you completely demonstrate you know nothing about Hamas.
All right, so I want to hear your response to this. Full disclosure, this is out of my depth. Again, this is not my issue. But if, in observing all these discussions and debates, if there's one thing that appears to be the most compelling from what I've watched, so there's a couple things Douglas said there, but the first part about I've yet to see any plan, any proposition put forth about what Israel could have done differently that would have been better and more effective, more efficacious, generally would have helped the cause of freeing the hostages and halting the conflict. I think I've heard you recently respond to that, and I think you said that, well, the onus is not on me to give that plan. The onus is on Israel to provide that proposition. But I've yet to hear anyone clearly articulate. Maybe you have. Maybe I haven't heard you say that. But what do you say to Douglas about what's the better plan that has apparently not been articulated? And if it is articulated, Douglas will tell everyone in Israel that he can and share that plan.
Yeah, well, okay. First of all, I just to be clear, I responded that when I said that when I was on Tucker Carlson, specifically responding to Matt Walsh, who was saying that, like, oh, Dave's saying he's against killing the babies, but he doesn't have another plan. And I was just kind of pointing out that, like, hey, when you're taking the pro-life position, the onus isn't on you to have an alternative plan. You can just sit here and say, I'm against murdering babies. Like, so anyway, that was the point I was making. But I would just point out
fair
first, and I will address this, but I would point out first that, like, Douglas Murray, again, a lot of these things are framing tactics and just not particularly honest ones. So like when he says something like, well, if you have a plan where there's no civilian deaths, then I'm all ears. Or you have a plan where there will be no deaths on the IDF side, then I'm all ears for that. But it's like, that's just that's a unfair standard. Like, just for example, let's just say, hypothetically speaking, not claiming they're doing this, but let's just say that the IDF went into Gaza and just started lining up the babies and shooting them in the head one by one. And you were to go, oh my God, this is horrible. You can't conduct a war this way. And then I were to say to you, well, do you have a plan where there's 0 civilian casualties? That would be like a ridiculous retort to what you're saying, because no, you don't have to have the perfect plan to say there could be something better than this. Now, to his point about how there's simply no negotiating with Hamas, this is just bullshit. This is just wrong. And Israel has negotiated with Hamas throughout this entire conflict. Now, Israel has violated a lot of the agreements that they've reached with Hamas, and Hamas, I think, has violated a few of their own agreements as well. But this is where they've been the most successful retrieving the hostages. In fact, it was Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, who first worked out the ceasefire deal. And in the phase 1 of it, they got 20 hostages returned. And they were supposed to get the rest of them in phase 2. But then Israel went and violated the ceasefire agreement. Now, okay, you could say that's their choice to go about it. But the idea that, look, like, I'm not saying you could trust Hamas. I don't trust any of the parties involved here. But Hamas did make an offer to return all of the hostages within a week or two of October 7th. Israel didn't want to take the deal. Now, maybe they wouldn't have come through on that deal, but I'm just saying they have negotiated, and there have been times where Hamas has come through on releasing hostages. In terms
what about Douglas's point that, but it's the military intervention that's resulted in the return of the hostages?
It's an assertion without evidence behind it. I mean, if the kinetic military might was what made Hamas bend, then how come they haven't bent more? It's just not true. It's not true. Listen, the plan that was on the table, the ceasefire that Witkoff got through, okay, it was all, that plan had been on the table since May of 2024. Joe Biden wanted it, but he wasn't able to get Israel to agree to it. Okay, what happened is they came in and they put pressure on Israel. Witkoff put pressure on Israel to get them to agree to the deal, and that's what got Hamas was already at the table. They had already accepted the deal since May of the previous year, and so the idea that it was just the military might of the IDF, well, then how come it didn't happen until Witkoff came in and put pressure on the Israelis? This just isn't true. It's an assertion, but it's not borne out by any of the facts. Now, in terms of what Israel could have done different, I mean, look, there's enormous possibilities for what they could have done. And it should be pointed out that until Netanyahu, Israel never treated its terrorism problem as a problem for the regular old military. They always fought terrorism, and they've had a terrorism problem since the creation of the state. They always fought terrorism with special operations, with targeted assassinations, things like this. Now, innocent people still die in those, but not nearly to this level. And so to say, look, post October 11th, I think it would have been wise for Israel to continue to embrace that, to use, I mean, after all, Gaza is the most surveilled area in the world. Like, if you think the IDF can pull off these targeted attacks against Hezbollah and the Iranians, but there's no chance they can do that in Gaza, it's just simply not true. They could have negotiated for the release of the hostages. They could have had a real investigation into what happened on October 7th, which we still have not gotten. Probably Max Blumenthal's documentary is the closest we're going to come to it. They also could have taken this opportunity to really win over the world and demonstrate to them how much they were bending over backward to avoid civilian casualties. And instead, what they did the week after October 7th was turn off all the electricity and water to Gaza. They immediately declared war on the civilian population. And so, again, I'm not claiming to be some military strategist or expert, but there's a million different ways they could have dealt with this. And the most important one would have been to really finally take their boot off the neck of the Palestinian people, for them to in some way acknowledge that, like, yeah, this status quo cannot continue. It simply just can't. It's a completely unreasonable expectation that we're just going to rule these people in perpetuity forever. That is the official position of the Israeli government. We're not for a two-state solution, and you can't have a one-state solution. So you just live as second-class non-citizens for the rest of your life. And so, look, I think there's lots of different ways. I think they could have upped border security. They could have had a real investigation. Netanyahu should have resigned in disgrace. They could have done targeted strikes. They could have had special operations missions. They could have done lots of things other than this. There's no reason why it was a given that they have to have the utter and total destruction of Gaza. And in terms of, Douglas Murray saying that the two goals for the war were to retrieve the hostages and get rid of Hamas. Well, it's like, if you notice, which is kind of what I gave you some pushback for a few minutes ago, but whenever we're talking about Israel or the West, their stated goals are always taken as a given. They're always look, this is just complete bullshit. And in fact, this is why this was South Africa's entire case that they brought to the ICJ, who ruled it was plausibly a genocide, was that they could just show you the Israelis in their own words admitting what their aims were. They were talking from the very beginning about how their aims were to ethnically cleanse Gaza and annex the entire thing. And their aims are to annex the West Bank as well. And they're moving toward that. They're still moving toward that to this day. Douglas Murray himself conceded on the podcast what U.S. and Israeli intelligence have already conceded, which is that they can't eliminate Hamas. They already know they can't eliminate Hamas. Hamas is still there. It seems to be as strong as ever. This was not the best. If your goal was to retrieve the hostages, this was the worst way to do it. You don't level a place if you want to get people out safely. The goal of eliminating Hamas is a nice goal, but it can't be achieved. And so what could be achieved was just decimating Gaza and slaughtering in the most brutal fashion tens of thousands of innocent men, women, and children. So yeah, I don't think that was a good strategy.
You mentioned targeted airstrikes, and I imagine the counter argument to that is, well, how are targeted airstrikes or special military operations possible when Hamas uses ordinary civilians as human shields? How can you target Hamas if there's people in the way?
Yeah, well, I guess so. Then the answer is we just kill all the people because this is a problem. It's like, okay, but so if what they're claiming is we can't get to Hamas because they're in these underground tunnels, but we sure can starve and slaughter the people. So I guess we'll just go with that as a second best option. I mean, look, it's true that it is true that Hamas it has been reported several times that they dress in civilian clothes. It has been true too that they've found, certainly maybe not to the extent that the Israelis claim, but they certainly have found weapons and bunkers underneath schools and hospitals and things like that. But the other flip sides of this is that, it's all framing. It's like, okay, but stated differently, this is an asymmetrical war, if you can even call it a war. Yes, Gaza does not have a government. Gaza does not have a military. Gaza does not have an air force. Gaza does not have, you know what I'm saying? So like, yes, this is how guerrilla asymmetrical wars like this work. And it does, I'm not denying that does make it a tough puzzle to solve. But the solution to that is not you flatten the place that has over 1 million children occupying it.
Okay. Yeah, but like, what about the argument the people sometimes throw hypothetically, like Hitler? If you want to kill Hitler, but he's underground someplace where there's 5,000 kids and ordinary people, is it justified to have casualties to destroy a unique extreme evil like Hamas?
Yeah, but baked into the Hitler example is the idea that, like, which is not exactly historically accurate, but the idea that we'd all be speaking German. If it was like the idea baked into that example is that this guy's going to take over the whole world and subjugate it if we don't free him. That's not the case with Hamas. Hamas was always Israel never even respected Hamas. It's a huge part of the reason why they pulled off October 7th. It was Netanyahu, his own words, said we can control the height of the flame while he was propping up Hamas. That's part of the reason why they wanted to do it, because they were like, we can control these guys. They're nothing. They're not going to touch us. Hamas doesn't even rule Gaza. They're not taking over the world anytime soon. And so the idea that we have to get into these, like, I think this is part of the reason why Daryl attacks the World War II mythology so much, because it's like this justification that we can therefore just start slaughtering people anytime we want, because what if it was Hitler? Hamas is not the Nazi Germany. They're not a force that's taking over most of Europe, poised to maybe take over all of Europe. That's just not the example at all. And so, Israel is the one in the position of power here. There's just no debate about that. Israel is 100,000 times more powerful than Hamas is. And so to slaughter all these people, to try to get at them is just, it's not justified.
Right. Yeah. So the other side is saying that Hamas uses people as human shields. And you're saying, well, that doesn't mean you just indiscriminately bomb people. But then militarily, what do you do then? Like you're saying, it is at least theoretically possible to have targeted airstrikes, some sophisticated military technology. Is that what you're suggesting? That you could?
I think there's many other possibilities other than what they did here. But like I said, throughout the entire history of Israel's existence, pre-Netanyahu, it wasn't until Netanyahu that they started fighting like this. They always used targeted assassination campaigns, special operations missions, things like that. And yes, it is true that you put your own soldiers at greater risk sometimes when you do that. But anyone who served in Iraq or Afghanistan will tell you that we constantly did that. We constantly put our soldiers in greater risk to minimize the number of civilian casualties, because that is the expectation of how modern societies fight wars. This is the reason why after World War II, we instituted international law, international humanitarian law. It's because we were like, hey, we're not allowed to do that anymore, especially now in the era of nuclear weapons. We're just not allowed to fight wars like that anymore because it's horrible and barbaric.
So your evidence that there could have been more targeted strategic airstrikes is that you're saying Israel in the past has been more judicious in doing these airstrikes?
No question. Yeah. There's for their whole history. And look, I mean, that's not to say that innocent people don't still die, and there's not to say that there's not still problems with that approach. I mean, I'm not like, and how justified is that? I mean, I don't know. This is an interesting philosophical debate. I don't know if you can ever really claim it's exactly justified to kill innocent people. I think you might have a situation where you have two horrible options, and that one horrible option seems better than the alternative. But the idea that, like, look, after 9/11, America had tremendous support from the world. They were having candlelight vigils in Iran after 9/11. I'm not saying there were some people who were celebrating it, but many, many more, orders of magnitude more people felt bad for America. And if you could just run the counterfactual in your mind, imagine we had wrapped up the war on terrorism by Christmas of 2001, which we could have. We didn't have to fight a regime change war against the Taliban. We certainly didn't have to invade Iraq. We could have just done what we did immediately after 9/11 and had our special forces and special ops take out the Al-Qaeda camps in Afghanistan, which we did immediately in the months following 9/11. And imagine then we had pulled back, and then we had said, to the world, we had been like, listen, there are grievances that are coming from this part of the world, and we do understand those. It is still not acceptable to kill any of our people, and we are going to hunt down every last Al-Qaeda terrorist and still try to take them out if they pop up anywhere. But we're also going to stop propping up dictators in the Middle East, and we're going to pull our bases out of Saudi Arabia because we recognize that this is provoking a lot of hatred for us in the region. And we could have won the day and maintained our moral high ground. And Israel had a similar opportunity after October 7th to really, I'm not saying there should have been zero violence in response. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying they shouldn't have gone after some of the Hamas people who had committed October 7th, but they could have also said, we're doing a two-state solution now. We're actually, we're going to go get those people, and then we're ending this. We're ending this 60-year occupation. They could have liberated the West Bank. That would have been a good sign of good faith to the world if they had really wanted to be like, listen, we're not in the business of trying to occupy and subjugate people. So we're going to liberate the West Bank right now. We're giving them their own state. Even if they did that and then said, hey, we still have to maintain some military action in Gaza. I'm just saying there's lots of different options here. They pursued none of them. Instead, they decided we're going to flatten the place, and now we're going to ethnically cleanse it. That seemed like the worst option available.
Right. So you're not opposed to targeted airstrikes, which do kill some civilians. There are some casualties, in theory.
I mean, I find it preferable. I'll say that it's
Yeah.
preferable
Yeah.
to flattening the entire place. Sure.
Right. And one other thing on that is I think Douglas in that Michael Moynihan podcast, we didn't play the clip, but he talked about how Bill Clinton made some offering where it was 99% of what the Palestinian Authority, I think, wanted. They rejected it. So there was some
Yeah,
possibility of negotiation.
It's a really misleading claim. It's a really misleading claim. And you can go read about it and in all of the different like peace accords that was never they never truly offered them a real state. And there were all types of poison pills that the Israelis put in the deal. There were also deals that probably I would say the Palestinians should have accepted that they didn't, but it's just not accurate to say that it's like, oh, we just wanted to give them everything they wanted and they kept turning down everything they ever wanted. And the other thing is like, so why, even by the Israeli propaganda on this, it's like, and so why is that offer off the table now? Why, what you made it once in the year 2000, so then you just get to occupy someone forever because one of their leaders, who according to Israel wasn't even a legitimate leader, so one illegitimate leader turned down a deal and now you never met. You don't need, listen, Israel has no right to control Gaza or the West Bank. It is not Israelis. It does not belong to them. The entire international community is like unanimous on this. This is not Israel. They don't have a right. They could just end the occupation. They don't even have to make a deal with the Palestinians. You could just stop. You could stop what you're doing. It's like saying like, I would, I would abolish slavery, but we offered the slaves 97% of their freedom 20 years ago. So we're just going to keep enslaving them. It's like, this is ridiculous. You could just free them and then they could figure out what they're going to do. None of this is a real defense.
And you're saying Israel could have negotiated better, like beyond military action, there could have been far better negotiations with Hamas. The other side will say, well, Hamas is just not reliable to negotiate with and they would violate it.
Well, I mean, look, that is possibly that would have happened. I'm not in the business of cheerleading for Hamas. Maybe. All I could tell you is what I know. And what I know is that when Witkoff pressured the Israelis into that ceasefire in phase 1, the Hamas had to release 20 hostages, and they did. Now, that doesn't mean they wouldn't have violated some other agreement. But look, even if Israel had pursued that agreement and then Hamas violated it, well, now Israel would have been in a position where they had a moral leg to stand on in saying, look, we were just trying to get our hostages back. By the way, it's worth noting that some of the only Israelis who have been protesting this war have been the family members of the hostages themselves, because they've been furious about the way, if you could imagine, right? If you had, I think I'd be pretty pissed off if one of my loved ones was in there and then they just started bombing the place. Like, Jesus, that's not going to get them back alive. And so that's the reality.
Yeah, but Douglas has been in Israel for a couple of years reporting on the ground, and that's not what he's reporting.
That's right.
I think I'm reaching the extent of my ability to steelman as much as I can, poorly or compellingly. I don't know. People like Douglas Murray, Sam Harris, and the neoconservative side. But I appreciate what you have to say and your insights, and I think you're making a lot of sense. I'd love to see more debate on this and more conversation instead of what is just a lot of we spend most of this conversation on you're not an expert, you're a comedian, you're a comic, and I mean I just really don't like this tactic that Douglas just will always refer to you now as comic Dave Smith as a way of just diminishing you. It's just like why are you doing that, man? It's so condescending, so patronizing, and it just like it's self-defeating when you do stuff like that. You sound like the bully in like grade 10 making fun of the 5th grader kid, but actually the 5th grader might have some more compelling points than you do.
Yeah. Listen, this is it has been Douglas's choice to make this debate what it turned out to be, and it's kind of his choice to keep going with this. I'm in this weird situation of just kind of watching it and going, all right, I mean, if you want to keep doing it this way, you seem to be kind of, he could say all the things about, he said, I'm a clown and that's in my job description, but it's like, one of us clown themselves here and it doesn't seem to be me. So, whatever. But I got to run because I got a meeting coming up here in 1 minute, but I really did enjoy this very much. And I appreciate your attitude and your open mind and your spirit of charity across the board, I think is something that we could use a lot more of.
Yeah, for sure. And before we go quickly, there's one reader question that came in of would you support some kind of independent media network, something alternative to CNN and Fox News, like people like yourself or Tucker Carlson or whoever else. My friend Bobby Azarian asked that question about creating some new system. I mean, Piers Morgan's sort of doing that, but something even more potentially niche. What are your
Yeah,
thoughts on that?
I'm open to all stuff like that. I mean, I think we're kind of doing that in a way already, where we all have our shows and then we do each other's shows and then we all kind of like built this little ecosystem. But I'd be open to, proposals of more stuff. I think we live in a brave new world and it's very exciting. And I think that that was in some ways, I think the me and Douglas debate, while I did not intend for it to turn into this, I think has almost become, it became not about the war in Ukraine or about Israel's destruction of Gaza or the US supporting it. It became about the old guard, the expert class versus the podcast world, And I do think that it was like one more piece of evidence that they are just losing. And this new media is where it's at. This is where the real dynamic conversations are happening.
Yeah, and what they're doing, it could have been effective if he was exposing your fallacies over and over again, and you were just going back to Wikipedia sources. Like I'm trying to think of a world where you could do that, where it's like, oh, I proved Dave wrong on 10 of these things, and it's because he's a comedian, he's not well read. But instead, it's none of the arguments, but it's all the comedian, where it's like the comedian could be right, he could be wrong, but you got to show, you could give an explanation for why someone's not making sense and say they're not well read, but they're just saying you're not well read, but not actually really making any strong claims about your arguments.
Yep.
But yeah, this was fun. I enjoyed this. I tried to be as charitable as possible. And Steelman, Douglas, and Sam, who, like I said, I've only had positive interactions with them. I will not say anything personally bad about them. I don't like doing character assassination. I do like mocking Douglas's comic Dave Smith line, which I find hilarious, him mocking you. But listen, I still respect those guys to a degree and would be happy to talk to them. But I hope they extend a little more charity in talking about you and being a little bit more honest on some of these things. But I hope steel manning them and trying to put their best case forward and trying to represent them fairly. I think I've done my job there. So, yeah. All right.